Despite the scope and scale of many fantasy works, role-playing games have always had a deliberately narrow focus. The earliest tabletop RPGs, such as Dungeons & Dragons, grew from the roots of earlier war games, but with a focus on a smaller group of characters rather than entire armies. As RPGs have grown and been adapted into video games, that focus on individual characters has always remained paramount. There is, however, a diversion of thought as to what that character focus should entail. For some, the focus is on narrative. What's important is what those characters do, their achievements, their personal arcs. This concept leads to larger narrative RPGs such as Dragon Age or Baldur's Gate, as well as the recent popularity of real play channels such as Critical Role. There's an equally valid school of thought that believes what's important is the power of those characters. Improving stats, getting new gear, and taking on harder and harder challenges with them. This was often a more pressing motivation in earlier Dungeons & Dragons adventures, while in video games it presents in the form of the action RPG. In games like Diablo or Torchlight, narrative is little more than an excuse to go dungeon crawling, and the loot you find in those dungeons and the XP you gain from slaying its dragons are the most important factors. Most commonly, these games focus on a single protagonist and feature a mechanical pace that can best be described as clicking on monsters, repeatedly. 2002's Dungeon Siege is therefore something of an oddity. It has all the sensibilities of an action RPG, yet maintains the group focus and the mechanical approaches more commonly associated with earlier Infinity Engine titles such as Baldur's Gate or Icewind Dale. It's a peculiar combination, though it takes time for it to reveal those peculiarities, since for the first couple of hours you'll be adventuring on your own. It's a classic start, cliché almost. One day a friend approaches your farm dying. He announces that a race known as the Krug are attacking and that you need to travel to the nearby town of Stonebridge to warn them and find a man named Gjorn. From there, it's a breadcrumb narrative. Gjorn sends you to Glassern to warn the Overseer there because he assumes the goblins are responsible. The Overseer sends you to reinforce the 10th Legion at Fortress Croth, and if you could find his errant mage along the way, that would be great, and so on through dungeon and wilderness until you reach the bowels of Castle Ebb to face the ancient evil that is awakened there. It's enough to tell you where you're going next, but feels mostly superfluous since the linear nature of the game world means that that would be your only place to go anyway. It's a couple of hours before you get your first companion, several more before you'll have a decent-sized party. This leaves a relatively weak first impression, and worse, means that the tutorial areas of the game don't actually ready you for the rhythms of gameplay that will be present in the bulk of your adventure. Combat is incredibly simplistic on a character-by-character basis, with the interesting elements of the system only really becoming apparent once you've got a handful of characters in your party. The early segments of just waiting for the auto-attack to kill everyone, occasionally chugging one of the potions you're inundated with, don't really prepare you for managing a full party, balancing their automation tactics, having to prioritise targets and ensure a good balance of offensive and support characters as those potions dry up in the latter portion of the game. The party's dynamic becomes far more important than the individual characters that make it up. This approach leads the skills system to be rather bare bones. There are no points to be distributed, and levels are only coincidental. You have 4 skills, melee, ranged, and 2 types of magic, and you gain experience with each of them as you use them to attack. At the same time, you gain experience in your 3 stats, strength, dexterity, and intelligence, again at different rates depending on how you're attacking. There are no active abilities or skill trees to worry about. There's no direct action required by the player upon a level up, it's just a thing that happens. This also means that there's nothing to be done in the way of experimentation. A common draw of action RPGs is in optimising and experimenting with different character builds, but here any time spent using anything but your primary method of attack is XP wasted. There's little reason to create any kind of hybrid build. The only possible exception would be if you are playing as a solo character and want a bow for pulling mobs on your melee character, or access to both schools of magic as a mage. Even then though, the micromanaging of XP levels required would likely become more of a nuisance than it's worth. As a result, most build crafting is done at the party level. Having 8 slots to deal with gives you a lot of room to experiment with different party compositions, even if those in your party are going to fall into one of 4 possible skill sets. You don't have to fill your party, however. Since XP is distributed based on damage, a full party will level up slower than a smaller one. Meanwhile, a solo adventurer will level far beyond what they would normally be able to in a group. Any number of characters is viable in its own way, but you'll face different challenges depending on your choice. It mostly comes down to the player's personal preference for managing the chaos of 8 party members at once, versus the chaos of having to kite enemies while chugging potions more carefully as an individual. If you want to bring a full party you can, and I'd argue you probably should, but if you want to be a lone warrior and fill the remaining 7 slots with pack mules to carry all the loot, you're just as welcome to do that instead. You're given a lot of freedom, so long as you have at least one humanoid party member you're good to go. That doesn't necessarily have to be your starting character either, you can kick them out once you have a second companion. This freedom comes with the downside that none of your party members are really characters in any meaningful way. Each one gets about 3 lines of dialogue, one when you meet them, one when you recruit them, and one in case you disband them. Each has a name and maybe even some vague motivation for travelling with you, but even if it's more complex than the fact you paid them, you won't hear about it again once they're in your party. This applies to both hired mercenaries along the way, and theoretically important characters too. Giorn is a friend of the farmer who first sent you to get help. Eulora is a scribe captured and forced to translate murals for your enemies. Merrick is the High Wizard of the 10th Legion, and the loss of his staff is the inciting incident for the entire plot. Beyond their brief introductions, however, they don't speak again for the entire game. No character dialogue or party banter. Once they're in your party, they have as much personality as the pack mules who carry your spare gear around. The pack mules are kind of an inelegant solution to a common problem in action RPGs. Since new equipment is your primary method of character development, you're going to be inundated with it pretty quickly. With limited inventory slots, that means constantly stopping the action to dig around in your backpack, switching out your gear, throwing out anything you don't need, and making space for items that you can't use yet, but might be useful a few levels down the line. This is slow enough with one character, but with 8 it means constantly stopping to re-equip all of them. The pack mules are terrible in combat, but let you lug around far more loot than a standard party member. This means you can carry more to sell at the various rest stops around the world, or it means you can go longer between major loot redistribution, at the cost of it taking a lot longer to sift through once you do. A more common solution to this is the town portal scrolls system, but those aren't present and wouldn't work with the way the world is laid out. The town portal scrolls work when you are adventuring around a central hub for a while before moving on, but Dungeon Siege's world isn't laid out like that. Instead, you have a long road ahead of you travelling from rest stop to rest stop with no reason to return to earlier areas, meaning you're going to be carrying the loot until you find a vendor or dropping it in a big pile in the wilderness. Instead of an open world or a hub system, you start your adventure in the farmlands and fight your way all the way to the vaults beneath Castle Ebb. It's a completely linear journey, with few reasons to return to previous areas beyond accidentally missing an optional side path. There is side content here and there, optional caves and dungeons as well as some side quests, though they're strictly for the purposes of getting more gear and XP for your party. There's very rarely any narrative content among these side quests, and they're often badly signposted, making it difficult to tell which path may be optional and which is the critical, which can lead to backtracking. The linear structure isn't without its benefits, however. Dungeon Siege manages to complete its journey without a need for a single loading screen or break in continuity. This was a huge technical achievement at the time, with project lead Chris Taylor at Gas Powered Games suggesting that developing the system to let them load and unload parts of the world as you move through it likely delayed release of the game by months, if not years. To this day, it remains a genuinely impressive achievement that gives the game a lot of its charm and memorability. While there's no reason to, you can at any point turn around and retrace your steps all the way back to the starting zone. The various areas you visit, both dungeon and wilderness, all feel distinct while never feeling disconnected. The world feels cohesive. From the moment you leave the safety of your farm, it feels like you're on an adventure, always pushing forward towards your next goal. There's a great deal of variety in the locales you'll visit. None of them feel repetitive, and only a few feel out of place. In fact, the only zone that seemed redundant was a series of crystal caves that came shortly after ice caves, but that was more of an issue of being too close to one another for being so similar. Moving them further apart would have fixed the issue. It certainly shouldn't have been removed, since the zone itself demonstrates one of the other things that works really well about the world. Despite being light on narrative, the environmental design gives the world a sense of deep history. While there's little explicit lore, the world makes that lore feel understated rather than being absent entirely. Similar ruins scatter the realm, and hidden dungeons hint at people who came before. There are some nice storytelling touches here and there, despite not being connected to any actual stories. Like the strange ruins the goblins are excavating in their tunnels, or the huge map of the kingdom carved into a hidden room not far from Castle Ebb. One touch I'm particularly fond of is that the farmlands you start in and the land surrounding Castle Ebb, where the game ends, use the same tile set. There's a huge amount of variance in the areas between these 2 points, but the similarity between the two give a great sense of finally reaching your destination, reminding you of how far you've come since the start of your journey. Each of the areas you visit gives the impression of having a lot of history, even if the game is less than forthcoming on the details. This isn't too surprising, as writer and designer Neil Holford was brought on to develop a huge amount of lore which informed the game despite not being present within it. More detailed are the various races and enemies you'll encounter across the realm. Ebb is a human kingdom, but humans are far from the only power present, and the way they've treated those other races ultimately resulted in the calamity the kingdom now finds itself within. The Krug, who act as your first opponents, are seen as a disorganised group, an unintelligent rabble. The kingdom kind of ignored them, seeing them as incapable of being of any importance, so when they banded together and attacked, no one was ready for it. The goblins, meanwhile, have always been seen as something of a nuisance. Intelligent and wrongly presumed to be the masterminds behind the Krug invasion, but undeserving of being true citizens of the kingdom. Their tunnels are the most out-of-place area in the game by modern standards. They're a high-tech group of inventors, so when you're in their lair, you'll be facing machines. Suddenly facing tanks and robots armed with chain guns and flamethrowers creates quite a bit of tonal whiplash, though the inclusion of such seemingly out-of-place sci-fi elements has something of a history in video game RPGs. Crossing over between sci-fi and fantasy wasn't uncommon in early ventures into the genre. The first 3 Ultima games, and both the Wizardry and Might of Magic series, all feature significant sci-fi elements in their largely fantasy settings, though by the time of Dungeon Siege, the trend had long since receded. Even here, it's not nearly to the same extent, since the Goblins' technology seems a cross between steampunk works and the Da Vinci tank. Admittedly, these kinds of inclusions are once again becoming more common, though more grounded in their respective worlds, such as the Warforged and airships of Dungeons & Dragons' Eberron setting. The goblins also make for a massive shift in difficulty. More than any other enemy, the goblins tend to feature both the most ranged opponents, as well as the most common use of area of effect attacks. This makes your squishy backline characters far more prone to taking a lot of damage unexpectedly. A character needs to continue to be attacked after falling unconscious to actually die, and as long as you have a few resurrection scrolls, any remaining characters can bring back your healer to resurrect the rest. Full party wipes that demand you reload a save are quite rare, so I'm pretty sure I wiped my entire party more in the goblin tunnels than the rest of the game combined. The large area of effects frequently saw my support mages killed by accident, leaving the rest of the party to fall apart. The goblins are actually responsible for the troubles affecting the kingdom, though not intentionally and not in the way anyone initially thinks. They kidnapped the wizard Merrick and stole his staff, believing it to have great powers. It does, but not in the way they assumed. The staff is used to manage the wards in the Vault of Eternity beneath Castle Ebb. With both missing, the wards weakened, allowing the evil within, and the masterminds behind the attacks across the land to be freed. Despite being the grand villains behind all the threats in the game, the Sec are hugely undercooked. A lot of this is to do with them being one of the earliest elements developed for the game. When Holford was brought on, the game was already partway through development. While the plot and the world at the time were little more than a skeletal structure, the Sec were already present as the big bad, leaving little room to maneuver around them. They're a race of evil beings, and they've got nothing else going on. They're presumed to have once been a part of the Empire of Stars that ruled before the Kingdom of Ebb came to be, and after betraying the kingdom, they were locked in the Vault of Eternity so they could never again cause harm, which obviously didn't work. There's no sense of motivation behind the Sec, which is a shame since such motivations are present amongst all other major players. Even when you finally face down their leader, he doesn't provide any insight as to why the Sec were so evil, which undermines a major thematic element of the game. With the other races, they are fighting against Ebb now because of the way Ebb wronged them in the past. Each aggression is a result of Ebb's prior transgressions, all of their chickens coming home to roost at once, so to say. But the Sec just seem to be evil for the sake of being evil. They aren't opposed to the kingdom because it locked them up. They seem to have been evil, power-hungry necromancers even before that. This really undercuts the sense you get with every other major villain that you're saving the kingdom from its own past mistakes, creating complexities that leaves the Sec an underwhelming opponent in comparison. The same can't be said of the Droog. The Droog are by far the most interesting element of the game's narrative, and the starkest example of Ebb's past mistakes causing its current problems. The Sec trick the Droog into joining their fight against the kingdom, but it doesn't take a lot. Not because they're seen to be particularly gullible, but because the lies they're told align with how they've been treated in the past. The ancient dragon that the Kingdom of Ebb feeds criminals to starts sending drakes out to attack their settlements. When the Sec tell them it is doing so at Ebb's behest, they believe them, because this isn't the first time humans have moved against the Droog. They're the original inhabitants of the land, initially reluctant traders with the Empire of Stars, but as the Empire expanded, they forced the Droog into smaller and smaller reservations. Things didn't improve when Ebb took over, so when the Sec came along and said Ebb is attacking them, they're completely justified in believing it. They're also the only enemy you parley with. Fighting through their territory, you eventually come to their last major settlement, where they stop fighting you. Their leader tells you they were tricked by the Sec, and have recently seen the same drakes that attacked them attacking legionary patrols. Upon realising they have been deceived, they end their aggression. The Droog are also, arguably, the most problematic element of the plot. They are narratively and to a lesser extent aesthetically fashioned on Native American peoples in ways that can be uncomfortable at times. If you want to tell a story about an imperialist nation's mistreatment of a native population, then you certainly can't go wrong with drawing from the history of Native American peoples. Where you can go wrong is by stumbling over the same old tropes and stereotypes that come along with that. From their early trading being opened up by a guy who realised they'd trade their valuable wares for relatively worthless items, to their simplistic tribal get-ups, the Droog are still seen as being in some way lesser than the people of Ebb. This makes slaughtering them in their hundreds uncomfortable enough, but it somehow gets worse when you reach their capital. The Droog's home seems inspired by the abandoned cliff dwellings of the ancestral Puebloans. It's a densely packed group of buildings atop a cliff, and is an impressive area even amongst the other well-realised environments seen throughout your journey. Entering the settlement, they stop attacking you, which is a choice I support as it would have been even worse to continue the slaughter upon entering their homes. Unfortunately, they all start bowing before you as you pass by, which is somehow even more uncomfortable. Despite being set up as a complex and justified antagonist, at the final moments the game stumbles and places the Droog into a tired, noble, savage stereotype instead, subservient and powerless to stop you regardless. Instead of grappling with the wrong that has been done to them, the game is content to settle back into the status quo of them being beneath you and your adventuring party. Forgotten as you proceed to defeat the big bad for the kingdom that has done so much to subjugate the people of its lands. The party-based approach to an action RPG is a pretty unique experience, but Dungeon Siege suffers from a lack of context. There's a sense that far more world building went into development than made it into the game, so what made it into the game was only a bare bones plot, little more than was necessary to point you to the next group of enemies to kill and the next pile of loot to grab. I really wish the game had given more thought to the themes and narratives it was introducing, rather than simply brushing past them to get to the next combat encounter. While gas-powered games would move on to developing a sequel, an expansion would be developed by Mad Dog Software, taking a similar set of themes and mechanics while presenting them in new ways. In a funny sort of way, Legends of Aranna has almost exactly the same story as the Kingdom of Ebb campaign. An ancient evil, trapped by a powerful civilization, has escaped to seek revenge, aided by the other races wronged by their captors. The details are different, presentation too at times, but the broad strokes are exactly the same. The only major change is that this time you're an outsider. You take the role of a fledgling hero from the town of Arhok, last in a long line of heroes. One day a supply caravan carrying an important artifact is ambushed on the way to town, so it's up to you to follow in your parents' footsteps and get it back. That overarching goal doesn't change, as you trace your parents' footsteps far from Arhok and all across the island of the Utrayans. It's always with the goal of reaching the next area the Staff of Stars was seen, along with the Shadow Jumper that now holds it. Being about half the length of the base campaign, you won't reach as high a level, but the expansion also introduces party members a lot quicker. You'll barely be 10 minutes out of town before you meet your first companion, a nature mage, ensuring that you have a healer available from the start of the game. You'll gradually gain a full party throughout your adventure, which is fortunate since, due to some changes to the way characters are implemented, the more the better. They've got a little more going on narratively than their counterparts in the previous campaign. Not a lot, but more extended introductions and clearer motivations to travel with you. While they still don't have any major dialogue beyond this, they do now have command barks. Unfortunately, they're quite frequent command barks, with very few per character, so you want to fill out your party as much as possible so you aren't forced to hear the same 2 lines repeated over and over again. As well as your companions, the dungeons you visit are given more character as well. This doesn't become apparent immediately, as you venture through some wilderness, then a cave, then more wilderness, then more cave. As you trek deeper into that second cave, however, you eventually come across a bridge spanning a wide cavern. Beneath you is revealed a huge number of spider creatures, which makes for a great moment of tension. As you reach that cavern, you find they are emerging from a set of ruins. The base campaign clearly delineated its areas, but in the expansion, dungeons will often switch tile sets midway through, making them feel less uniform. They're also laid out in a more naturalistic way. While still strictly linear, the overworld and dungeons both feature more alternative paths, making them feel more open, but in dungeons this is also used to make them feel more like a real place. The upper layers of the ruins were clearly living quarters, and as you descend deeper they give way to research labs until you finally find the source of the monsters. Throughout this descent, you'll also find scrawled notes and journal entries detailing the nature of the place, and a voice taunts you from deep within. It gives the dungeon a sense of its own narrative beyond simply being the caves or the mines. You understand eventually that this was a Utrayan research centre, a race of beings who once controlled an empire larger, stronger and older than the Empire of Stars that preceded Ebb. They were long since thought extinct, but here you find remnants of the research that would lead to their downfall. The Utrayans were effectively performing genetic mutations upon what they saw as lesser species. They believed it to be uplifting them, giving them intelligence, but in reality they were creating slave races. One of these experiments, the Lost Queen, was awoken by the Shadow Jumper as he passed through, and she is hungry from her long slumber. The spider monsters she is spawning are the same as those used by the Sec. You'll meet repentant Utrayans later in the expansion, but the way the Empire is portrayed, it feels like the team were angling the Sec to be what remains of those who were unrepentant and bought even more into their own deluded supremacy. Lore books in Dungeon Siege 2 will contradict this theory, though, which does feel like a huge missed opportunity. Defeating the Lost Queen is a marginally more complex boss fight than anything seen in the base game, and opens the way to the island of the Utrayans, where the Shadow Jumper himself awaits. These more pronounced narratives tucked within each dungeon are one of my favourite additions in the expansion. The base game had a great deal of variety, but at times felt like just a procession of different environmental palette swaps. In the expansion, each feels like its own miniature yet complete adventure module. Each with its own micro-narrative, and often its own villain. The overarching plot is still very simplistic, but being broken up into smaller parts with their own narrative identities makes it feel less homogeneous, as well as adding a greater sense of context to each of those stops on your adventure. Some changes to the game also filter back into the Kingdom of Ebb campaign. A large number of quality of life features were introduced with Legends of Aranna, including a sell all button at merchants, and a redistribute potions button that shares out health and mana potions depending on your party's stats. In fact, that one might be the single greatest quality of life feature added to any action RPG, and it's a travesty that it didn't make it into the sequels. New types of gear also make their way into the game, though the set items are exclusive to the expansion. This is a good decision. Often set items in games like this succumb to one of two flaws. Either they're the most powerful items in the game, but upon completing the set you no longer have anything to work towards, or you get them too early and they're quickly outpaced before you can complete the set. Here they're hand-placed, allowing them to be mechanically relevant to the power curve while also being narratively integrated into the world, most notably with the remains of your parents' equipment that you find along your journey. New spells also make their way into the fray, as well as an adjustment that makes using them more viable. In the original game, your mages could have 2 spells equipped at a time, but if you wanted to use a third, the process of switching it out was kind of a pain, especially mid-combat. There's a huge number of spells across both schools, not just for dealing damage, but summons and various support effects too, but the nuisance of switching them mid-combat disincentivized their use. With the expansion, you can now hotkey equipment sets, allowing you to switch between several configurations of spells at a key press. The problem is this works at a party level, so not only do you have to choose what every member of your party will be using for that specific hotkey, but it also interrupts their actions since it counts as re-equipping their weapons or spellbooks. As a result, every time you use one of these hotkeys, your entire party will forget what they were doing and revert to their automated instructions, which can break your carefully constructed formations, limiting their usefulness. The island of the Utrayans is unlike anything seen in the base game. While the expansion reuses many of the tile sets from the previous campaign, it also adds several of its own to flesh out the new lands. The island is primarily a series of dense jungles, inhabited by the various races created by the Utrayans, mostly the cat-like Hassat and the Zarask lizardmen. There are a few remaining settlements of Utrayans, and many more ruins on a much grander scale. Their structures take on a vaguely Mesoamerican aesthetic. Their remaining city is a series of richly engraved but worn-down buildings scattered across pillars connected by bridges, but their ancient ruined cities consist of large stone ziggurats in the jungle. It even goes so far as to detail how these ziggurats once had wooden structures atop them, much as would have been the case in their real-world analogues. It all works to create a sense of distance between you and the ancient Utrayans. The actions that caused the current crisis happened long before the events of the game, much like they did in the Kingdom of Ebb. The problem is that in both cases it creates a story that insists it is about redemption, but here you are not part of the group that requires redemption. Your character's personal connection to the narrative is not in righting the wrongs of your ancestors, but to follow in your parents' footsteps and to get a magic stick back from the Shadow Jumper. It makes the Utrayans that remain feel kind of helpless. A few are trying to make pilgrimages or do research into their past to better understand the current threats, but it's always your adventuring party that's going to have to complete these tasks for them. A far cry from the people who were once so advanced they had their own empire-wide teleportation network complete with underground stations. The writing in Legends of Aranna has a significantly more comedic bent to it at times, such as the merchant who claims he gets all his wares from big piles of equipment that adventurers leave lying around, but it's most notable in the Central Transportation Centre, a huge and ornate marble station beneath the jungle ruins, within which distorted passenger announcements still play over the PA system, reminding you that there is no need to tip your Zarask porters. Interspersed with this are notes and diary entries from the last defenders of the city, desperately trying to cut off the transport network as the Zarask uprising topples the Empire. The time that has passed since makes the Utrayans' mastery of both magic and technology feel less anachronistic than the goblins of the base game, while also tying into it by later revealing that much of the goblins' technology is derived from old Utrayan works, which may go back to explain those ruins they were excavating. It starts feeling anachronistic again, however, when you reach the Great Clock. The Great Clock is a Utrayan creation that controls the seasons across the entire world of Aranna. It's too big and important a piece of the world to feel like a natural inclusion at the end. While the journey through the valleys preceding the Great Clock are suitably apocalyptic, The Shadow Jumper's plan to lay waste to the entire world by destroying it feels too sudden and melodramatic. Given you previously completed your own arc by defeating the Zarask that killed your parents and found their final resting place, a climax more focused on the Utrayans specifically would have worked better. Instead, it's a pretty generic save the world motivation. It doesn't help that the Shadow Jumper suffers from much the same problem as the Sect did. He's completely underdeveloped as an entity. You know the Utrayans captured him and locked him up to use his powers, but it's never clear what those powers were or what they were used for. He's the weakest aspect of the plot by far. Several of the minor villains across the expansion's various dungeons get more backstory and character development than he does, and as such he's about as underwhelming as the fight against him is annoying. It's strange to see the expansion reuse so many overarching plot elements in different ways, while still making the same mistakes as the original campaign. The primary villain being the least interesting, least developed element of the plot is disappointing yet again, but having smaller, more detailed narratives running through each of the individual sections of the game is a welcome improvement. Legends of Aranna isn't the last campaign for the original Dungeon Siege though. 3 other campaigns exist, developed by both Mad Dog Software and Gas-Powered Games, which are also worth taking a quick look at. Of the 3 official additional campaigns, Return to Arhok is certainly the shortest. Set after the events of Legends of Aranna, the hero of Arhok is awoken from magical stasis when the town is once again threatened. What follows is maybe an hour's worth of adventure, but it does cram a lot into that time. It's initially thought that the town is under attack by Hassat from the island of the Utrayans, but when you find them they reveal they're not the culprits. Their king has been kidnapped by the lizard men, and they'd like your help to rescue him. It twists again when it turns out the Zarask who kidnapped the king are actually undead, thralls of a creature called Rax, another of the Utrayan experiments much like the Lost Queen at the start of Legends of Aranna. It's a short but quite engaging little adventure, a few overworld areas in a dungeon and little else. It feels very much like an example campaign. Dungeon Siege had an editor released for it, allowing people to develop their own adventures and campaigns. Return to Arhok feels like it was intended as an example for those people to learn from. Less unwieldy than examining the full campaign, but still containing everything the engine is known to be capable of for players to examine. This includes several elements that the base game and its expansions never touched upon. One of the Hassat joins you in your quest, but as a friendly NPC following you rather than a full companion. An early NPC gives you scrolls to level you to an appropriate level. Even something as simple as an NPC attacking you after a conversation. All of this feels like it was originally intended as a showcase of what can be done with the editing tools that was then expanded upon and polished into a bonus campaign. A pretty decent one as well. While incredibly short, the dungeons and overworld maintain the more naturalistic layouts of Legends of Aranna. Besides a slightly underwhelming ending, it provides a very solid module that could have fit into the expansion campaign easily. Yesterhaven, on the other hand, provides an experience quite unlike its longer brethren. It opens with your adventurer approaching a small ruined town, and as you're investigating, being whisked back in time. When you arrive, the town is beset by a blizzard sent by the Snow Queen. Defeat her, and you return to the town now invaded by the undead, prompting you to hunt down the Lich Lord in his tomb. When you confront him, the truth is revealed. The Fire King prompted the town's undertaker to steal a chalice from the Lich Lord in exchange for a pendant to make his love fall for him. This chalice allowed the Fire King to travel through the Valley of the Dead to assault the Snow Queen's towers, which she believed the townsfolk permitted. Seeing the error of her ways, the Snow Queen protects the town from the increasing temperature, while you descend into the Fire King's forge to defeat him and return the Lich Lord's chalice. Completing this task, you return to town only to find yourself back in your own time, the town once again forgotten ruins. It's a really neat little story. Tonally, it feels far more like a fairy tale than the more traditional fantasy adventures of the other campaigns, but as much as I enjoyed the narrative, it's very much the secondary focus of the campaign. Yesterhaven is a multiplayer-only challenge map. Each of the three zones, ice, death, and finally fire, presenting an increasingly difficult sequence of dungeons to be completed. There's a very large number of enemies in each, but strangely it's also strictly a low-level adventure. Some of the other campaigns, when played in multiplayer, allow you to access tougher versions which scale the enemies and loot to higher levels, letting you bring a single character along multiple adventures. This seems like a no-brainer for a challenge map, but Yesterhaven is only designed for characters starting at level 1. I'll admit I blew through it with a massively over-leveled character just to see what it was about, but I can't imagine it working all that well as intended. If I were into multiplayer and had a few friends to play with, I can see a series of difficult dungeons to work our way through being fun, but I doubt I'd want to start over at level 1 to do so. Especially since you need to make it through an entire third of the campaign in a single sitting, since you can't save your progress, only begin at the start of each of the three segments. Both mechanically and presentationally, it feels like it's expecting you to bring a seasoned character from another campaign, but that's not the case, and I'm not sure the result works all that well because of it. The final campaign is also the longest, not just of the bonus campaigns, but of all the campaigns available. I'm afraid I don't have any footage of the Ukraine Peninsula. I went back and forth as to whether a full playthrough was warranted, and ultimately decided against. Released alongside the original game, the Ukraine Peninsula was a multiplayer exclusive campaign. It's far larger and far more open than the Kingdom of Ebb campaign, and unsurprisingly is the origin of the Ukrainians that appear in Legends of Aranna, even if they don't appear in person this time. The campaign focuses around trying to mend an ancient teleportation network. To this end, you travel across the peninsula, visiting its 8 towns, collecting from each a stone which you must bring to a central location. While zones are levelled, you can approach the map in any order you wish, and there's a large number of optional and secret dungeons available along the way. This is also all there is, however. With no effective way to save quest progress, the campaign can't handle anything more complex than collecting the 8 stones to track progress, since they can be stored in the player's inventory as they log off and on again. It's actually a very impressive campaign for what it is. If you enjoy the gameplay of Dungeon Siege and have a few friends to bring with you, then there's plenty of adventuring to be had here. For me though, I don't have those friends, and was getting a little burned out on Dungeon Siege's slightly simplistic combat by this point. The idea of an even bigger, even grindier campaign stuck with one character while I can't save midway through a dungeon didn't seem worth the time. The campaign isn't a simple rehash of Kingdoms of Ebb, mind you. Many areas are similar or repurposed, but the more open nature of the map around each town and the ability to travel freely or teleport between them gives it a fresh presentation, and that's before the elements that are exclusive to the campaign. Many of the most challenging dungeons in the game are present in this map, and overall it makes for a huge chunk of extra content. Just not content that's worth it for the story, for me, for now. Finding all 8 stones and bringing them to a central location unlocks the final dungeon, where the Ukrainians had trapped another great evil. The Malgin may be exclusive to this map, but narratively the only difference between them and the Sec is that you let them out at the end of the campaign and have to cram them right back in straight away, instead of them being let out at the start and you spending the entire campaign on it. If you do want to try it out, however, there's good news. While the multiplayer servers have long since been officially shuttered, single-player modifications of the campaign have been released by the community. I'm aware of 2. Ukraine Peninsula Revisited polishes it up a little and adds some companions. Meanwhile, Legends of Aranna also expands it somewhat by introducing several elements from the Legends of Aranna into the mix. If you do fancy a longer, more open though less narratively engaging adventure, I can recommend either of those. Just don't come crying to me when you find out just how accurately named the Pit of Despair is. Yesterhaven received similar treatment as well. In fact, in an impressively dedicated turn of events, all 5 campaigns from Dungeon Siege would see modded reworks that port them into Dungeon Siege 2 in the form of the Legendary mod for the next game, allowing you to experience all of these campaigns with the new mechanics of the sequels, if that's your preferred style of play. We won't be spending any more time talking about those, but the sequel itself is of course our next subject. Dungeon Siege 2 makes a lot of changes that improve upon the original, while bringing it more in line with the conventions of its genre. The problem is, I just don't like it as much. Part of that is due to taste. While the sequel significantly expands the amount of lore and narrative the game had, as well as improving on its characters, there are also changes in ways I just don't particularly connect with as well as the original. My biggest disconnect is with the start. Instead of a slower, lower stakes introduction that slowly grows over time, now you're treated with quite a major lore dump and then are immediately thrown in already halfway up the adventurer's ladder. I enjoy the kinds of low-level, low-stakes adventuring that the original opened with. It provides a more relaxed pace that opening as an already relatively accomplished mercenary can't match, while also providing plenty of room for the end of the game to feel appropriately climactic. It begins with you and your friend Drevin working for the bad guy. A fella named Valdis is looking for a mysterious artifact, and he's sending his orc-adjacent army, supported by the mercenary forces you're a part of, to retrieve it for him. It's held in an ancient temple on the island the Dryads call home. They're not willing to hand it over, so it's time to storm the beaches in landing craft dropped by dragons. The assault is successful, but as soon as Drevin asks about getting paid, Valdis murders him. I've had bosses like that. You awaken captured by the Dryads, and so set off on a journey of vengeance and retrieving the other artifacts before Valdis. Convoluted as that may sound, it's actually a simpler setup than the mysteries of the first. It gets right to the action and maintains a consistent villain and objective throughout the game, but starting you out already an adventurer lessens the impact of that journey. By the end, you'll be even more powerful and have achieved even more than the hero of Ebb, but it never feels like you've come as far, since you started further along the path. The more important changes, however, are to the gameplay. The original Dungeon Siege was unusual for its genre, and while the party and skill systems are maintained, they've been subtly altered. The sequel's changes keep it feeling the same in a lot of ways, but also simplify it in ways that removes a lot of the uniqueness the original had. The 4-class system that makes multi-classing pointless remains intact, though now XP is simply shared amongst your party rather than being based on the amount of damage each member inflicts. A good change that ensures your more support-focused or lower damage team members don't fall behind the levelling curve. Classes now have skills as well. Levelling up gains you points to be spent in the skill tree, letting you specialise in certain weapons or spell types, as well as unlocking powers. These powers are a nice addition, providing an extra tool to be used in combat, as well as further specialising and differentiating each of the classes. A fighter can now deal extra damage or focus enemies on them. Your nature mage can gather enemies in a spot to halt their advance, or let an area of effect attack be more effective on groups. It gives each member more utility instead of simply being different flavours of damage output. This does mean the game falls back into a trap that the original avoided, however. Action RPGs have a reputation for often featuring large, complex skill trees, but not actually having that many viable builds within them. You often find yourself having to research each class and work out the best way to build them before you start levelling, or later wind up too weak to proceed or needing to over-level in order to make it past a challenge. This is something the original game avoided by doing away with these kinds of skill systems. The skill tree in Dungeon Siege 2 aren't that large or complex, but it still expects you to, for example, commit your ranged party members to either bows or thrown weapons long before you'd have a chance to understand the mechanical differences. When I make these videos, I usually play the games unmodded as far as possible. I of course use anything necessary to make older games run on modern systems or translate them, but I won't run any mods that affect gameplay or visuals, and tend to avoid even major bug fixes unless there's a good reason. I made 2 exceptions with Dungeon Siege 2. The first is a simple respec mod. You can reassign skill points in the expansion, but not the base game. And I've never been a fan of finding myself having to replay large segments of a game because I built my character wrong. In theory, this doesn't change anything, though in practice it does let you make more powerful characters than you might otherwise have had access to unless you were deliberately pooling your points for later. Nonetheless, I felt it a worthwhile change that allowed me a little more freedom to experiment with different party builds without needing to replay the game several times. The second mod was both more and less impactful. I increased the party limit. Dungeon Siege 2 reduces your character limit to 6, but only if you've already beaten the entire game twice. Difficulties are modelled on the original game's multiplayer, where high difficulties are for higher level players. In the sequel, this means beating the game once to unlock the second difficulty, and again for the third, and only in the third are you allowed 6 party members. At the base difficulty, you're limited to just 4. This effectively limits you to one of each class on your first playthrough, which further limits how you specialise those classes. You can't really specialise your fighter to dual wielding or two-handed weapons, you need them to use a shield to tank. Your nature mage can't specialise in summons, you need them as a healer, especially since potions no longer heal instantly, but rather slowly and over time. I instead modded the limit back up to 6 for the first run, both letting me experiment more with builds, and more importantly, let me bring more characters along, because in a major improvement, your companions are actual characters now. Beyond simply a name and a class, your party now have their own backstories and ambitions. It's nothing to the extent of the narratively focused games of the genre, but it makes your adventure far more lively than before. They each have dialogue throughout the game, discussing events, making observations, chatting to each other. Some of these dialogues have an annoying tendency of activating just outside aggro range of enemies and getting cancelled partway through when combat starts, but it's a good sign that I was annoyed by that rather than relieved. Travelling with Tar, the dryad you meet when she removes your shackles, who worried about you catching the plague, who joined your party to deliver the cure you found to her sisters in the exile camp, and who continued with you beyond that, compelled to help those in need, is far more engaging than travelling with Eulora, the scribe who you met in a crypt, and didn't say another word to, even as you descended together beneath the bowels of Castle Ebb. They're a likeable bunch, and each gets even more chance to display their personalities through their own quests. There's one each, some simple and taking just a few moments off of the beaten track, others longer and not reaching their conclusion till the final act, but each is a good chance to better get to know your party members. Unfortunately, each of these is let down by the structure of the game's side content. Do I want to help Princess Evangeline rescue her men? Yes. Do I want to go treasure hunting with Deru? Of course, treasure hunting is great, and Deru was nice enough to check in with me to see what I want done with my corpse when I inevitably die as a result of our collective fool's errand, so of course I want to help her out. The problem is, in each case it's going to require a huge amount of backtracking to accomplish. Princess Eva's quest, for example, requires you returning to a previous area from before you even met her just to start it. Deru's requires travelling back to the previous act to find her first objective. Many of the side quests are like this, which creates a conundrum. A completionist playthrough is going to find themselves massively over-leveled for much of the side content, meanwhile a non-completionist is going to miss almost all of it. Of the 8 companions who can join you on your travels, only 3 of them have side quests which don't require some form of backtracking to a previous area or act. Despite the world being far expanded from the previous game, all this backtracking makes it feel lesser. It's no longer one cohesive world through which you trek ever onward. Rather, it's about a half-dozen zones connected by portals. Then, even inside those areas, a teleport network will have you fast travelling around within each act. There are still large interconnected areas where the game seamlessly flows from dungeon to overworld and back, but it doesn't feel so significant when you'll be teleporting back and forth both for side quests and to return to the hub towns of each act. The implementation of hub towns, rather than rest stops, makes transmuting items you find into gold, as well as the pack mules, fundamentally useless, since you can just teleport to town and back whenever you need. Though arguably even returning to town becomes pointless, since you can now feed your excess equipment directly to your expanded roster of pets in order to power them up. The towns themselves are distinct from one another. First the Dryad city of Irulan, nestled high in the trees, then the elven town of Aman-Lu, recently devastated by Voldus' attack, and finally the occupied town of Calrathia. The world is much larger, but jumping back and forth or teleporting between zones disguises the scale, making it feel smaller and more artificial. The history of the world suffers a similar fate. The more detailed and explicit exploration of Aranna's history ironically ends up feeling more shallow in a way. Almost everything connects to a small set of historical figures or events, rather than being a mysterious element that feels more significant. I'm not sure I can go any further without detailing that backstory, so here's a quick ficto-mytho-historical crash course. Long ago, Zaramoth took control of the Empire of Stars, with the aid of his dark wizards, and a sword forged by the Utgard giants. As can be expected by someone who has dark wizards, Zaramoth wasn't a particularly popular ruler. This led not only to the war in which Ebb would break off from the Empire, but also the rise of a resistance against him, led by a human named Azionai. Azionai wielded a shield created by another race of giants, the Agarlans, and eventually the two met in battle. When the sword of Zaramoth struck the shield of Azionai, the resulting release of power caused the Cataclysm. Both were killed, their armies devastated, the river of souls beneath the world overflowed, releasing vast quantities of magic that was previously controlled by the Dark Wizards, and the lands were shattered. The Empire of Stars fell, the First Age ended, and importantly, the shield of Azionai was broken into 4 pieces. There's an art to coming up with memorable fantasy names, and unfortunately it's not an art Dungeon Siege is particularly well versed in. It's not so much of a problem in the original, where the lore isn't so important, and the locations are more clearly differentiated, but the sequel eschews both, bringing the problem of names into focus. There's too many of them, they're too similar, and they fall from the mind too easily. Remembering the difference between Kithraia, Calrathia and Kadarak is a pain, and your brain ends up shorthanding everything to its function, which, when functions match, makes the world feel more homogeneous than it is. There are some nice touches here and there. The elven town of Amanlu and the nearby Elenlu Isles hints at some kind of shared ancestry, as do the Vai Lutra and the Vai Kesh forests nearby. Interesting as it is as world building, it makes remembering which is which, and within which your objective lies, difficult, and is further muddied when Vai Kesh is also the name of the people who live within the Vai Kesh forest, though no Vai Lutra live in its counterpart. Doubly muddied when the Vai Kesh is only the elven word for it. They call themselves the Manu Ostar, and everyone else just calls them Dark Elves. Somewhere between the syllables and similarities, the proper nouns presented to the player make the narrative and your objectives harder to keep track of. It's not a huge problem, but I did have to spend far longer than normal double-checking every name while writing this script. Much of the world's backstory is revealed in the opening cutscene, but just in case you weren't paying attention, it is reiterated in parts throughout the early portions of your adventure by a cryptic scholar who aims to help you in your quest. Your old boss Valdis has found the Sword of Zaramoth, and now, with the aid of the same Dark Wizards, is seeking the pieces of Azionai's shield. Not that you see this as your problem straight away. Captured by the Dryads, your initial motivation is simply to convince them to let you go and then return to your home. It's a good moment when, as the scholar reveals the history of the world to you, and what Valdis is doing, you decide you need to stop him. Not because it's your fault or your responsibility, but because someone has to. A character that chooses to be a hero is so much more meaningful than a character who is chosen. I especially appreciate it in games because it more closely matches the motivation of player and character. I wasn't chosen to save Aranna from Valdis' hordes, so it's far more engaging when my character shares that motivation. Unfortunately, this is undercut later. Unlike the first game, you're free to choose any race for your character when playing in single player, a feature the original held exclusively for the multiplayer. This can undercut the narrative a little, since there are several aspects that make it feel like your character was intended to be an elf. Your home is the elven city of Amanlu, your childhood friends are all elves, there are even a few lines of dialogue both here and in the expansion that seems to imply you are supposed to be an elf. Regardless of your race, however, you are descendant of Azionai. You aren't the only one. The child ruler of Calrathia, your friend killed by Valdis, your companion Amran, in fact, possibly all of your companions are all also descendants of Azionai, but it's always implied you are, in some way, the most descendant of Azionai, possibly Azionai reborn in the same way that Valdis believes himself to be Zaramoth reborn. The reveal doesn't completely detract from the importance of your character choosing to step up and seek Azionai's shield, but watching the game sidestep such a common Chosen One trope only to step right back into it later is disappointing. The plot doesn't have much in the way of twists, save for right at the end, which we'll get to. You proceed from town to town, claiming the pieces of the shield in a quest to reforge it before finally facing Valdis in his fortress. To this end, you'll proceed with the standard action RPG activities, fighting enemies, collecting loot, defeating bosses, and all the while struggling with the one change that most negatively impacts Dungeon Siege 2. There are so many changes that are either better than or as good as its predecessor, but the loss of control over your party is such a downgrade that it makes it difficult to say whether the game as a whole is an improvement. You're no longer able to control your entire party at once, and yet at the same time, you can only control your entire party at once. Gone are the automation settings of the original, along with the ability to select multiple characters at once. Now you can only control one character at a time, and the rest of the party will be in one of two modes, Mirror or Rampage. There is also Wait and Defend, but there's no way to access them through the interface. They start without hotkeys, and they're even less useful than the other two. In Mirror mode, your entire squad will match your movement commands and attack your targets. In Rampage, they will generally follow you but attack at will. There's no way to adjust who they will attack, it's entirely out of your control at that point. You can still pause the game, but queuing up commands for each party member won't work. As soon as you unpause, the character you have selected will perform their most recent command, but the rest will either copy it or do their own thing. They forget any command you might have given them and revert to Mirror or Rampage. The simplicity of the system works well enough early on. When there's a tough enemy, use Mirror mode to focus on it. When there's several weaker enemies, Rampage to attack them all at once. As soon as things start getting more complicated though, the entire thing breaks down. You can't tell your ranged units to attack one target while your melee units target another. You can't even reposition your ranged units without everyone following them. If you want to pull a fighter back to get healed, then either everyone stops attacking and goes with them, or you give up control of who any of them are attacking. The same is true if your ranged units are firing into a wall. To move them out of the way, you need to move everyone. Neither option works well in any given situation. Since focusing your damage is more effective than spreading it out, you're likely to spend most of your time in Mirror mode. This means everyone is going to be bunched up in one place, at which point the sheer amount of units clipping through one another in a tiny spot, combined with the obstructing particle effects and damage numbers, makes reading a combat situation, or even choosing a specific target, next to impossible. This is bad enough in regular play, but it only gets worse once you hit a boss fight. Every major boss features plenty of high damage, large area of effect attacks that require careful movement to avoid, careful movement being something that this system simply does not allow for. In Rampage, your team will just stand their ground and not move. In Mirror, you're having to dodge spell effects for everyone at once. If they've spread out at all during combat, this gets even harder. An area will light up on the ground, but your party may be on different sides of it, meaning wherever you move, someone's going to walk straight into it. Dodging direct attacks is no easier, since if they're targeting your selected character and miss, they'll likely hit your other party members trailing behind. It feels like the boss fights were designed for an entirely different system, either for multiplayer where each adventurer is controlled by a different person, or the old system where you could pause and give different movement commands to everyone. In a couple of fights, you're expected to interact with elements of the arena while fighting too. This becomes impossible since, again, either you have to move everyone at once, or you have to leave the rest of your party to their own devices, where they will be oblivious to damaging effects. The original game could be very chaotic and difficult to control at times, but it usually felt like loss of control was a mistake on the player's part, that the player had allowed themselves to be overwhelmed. Here, you're never properly in control in the first place. It's frustrating to not be able to do something as simple as targeting two opponents at once, or even just moving a character on their own while the others continue what they're doing. Now every action interrupts everyone, whether that's because you all scramble to do the new thing you said, or because you've switched away and they've forgotten what you told them to do. The result is you never feel like you're controlling an adventuring party, while also never feeling like you're controlling an individual character. It's like you're playing as an amorphous blob of swords and spells, a six-limbed ball of chaos incapable of even moderately complex tactics, flailing helplessly until your team or your enemies are dead. Still as chaotic as the original game, but while there it felt like the chaos was something to fight against, here you have no choice but to succumb to it and hope things work out. What's lost in the mechanical sense of being an adventuring party is still present in the narrative, however. I'm a big fan of the kinds of small-scale, low-level adventuring that Dungeon Siege 2 did away with, but I'm also a fan of your characters growing from those adventuring roots and coming into their role as heroes. In the original that happened gradually. At the start you were a ragtag group of adventurers, at the end a skilled group of heroes, but it was difficult to pinpoint a moment when that shift occurred. In the sequel it happens during the siege of Snowbrook Haven. Just over halfway through the second act, once you've rescued the game's final companion, Princess Eva, and defeated one of the Dark Wizards. You sneak in through the servants' quarters, but it feels like you're actively having an impact on the siege once you arrive. Helping rescue Eva's troops, pushing back encroaching forces from the front gates, even when the assault takes a turn for the worse and you're forced to retreat, it feels like your party was genuinely able to live up to their heroic ambitions, rather than feeling like a random rabble that happened to be in the right place at the right time. It's a great, if surprisingly uncommon element in games' narratives to be able to pinpoint these kinds of occasions, and done well, as it is here, has the impact of shifting the tone of the remainder of play. This tone is maintained as you approach the last of the hubs at Calrathia. It's true the other hub towns weren't having the best time, with the Dryad City fending off Veldis' forces from their island, and the Elven town having had a meteor dropped on it for not handing over their piece of the shield, but Calrathia is actively under occupation from Valdis' army of Morden troops when you arrive. Like Snowbrook Haven, the actions you take here feel like something only your party could have achieved. You helped the other towns, but it was always with tasks someone else was already attempting. In Calrathia, you actively helped the town overcome their occupation, first by taking back their access to water, then by distracting the chief of the nearby Morden city. And by distract I mean murder, and by chief I mean everyone. It ends in a large fight within the walls of the hub as you help the townsfolk fight the occupying guards and free the city. It makes your passing through feel more notable. You aren't just lending a hand as a wandering adventurer, but are reshaping the lands as you pass by with your deeds, something you'll be doing to a far greater degree by the story's conclusion. Despite the narrative tone feeling like a step up, the actual zones you travel through are a little dry, literally and figuratively. The original game was very good at separating out locations. With the exception of the rural farmlands that bookend the game, each zone within was unique. The sequel's world repeats location types, as well as spending far longer within certain biomes. This makes the world feel far less varied than it actually is, and it's especially disappointing that much of the third act is spent in the second desert of the game. Funnily enough, the Diablo series seems to have a preoccupation with deserts as well, so maybe it's just a quirk of the genre, but if it is, it's an irritating one. Deserts are a particularly difficult location to get right in games due to their nature. It is said that there is nothing in the desert, and no man needs nothing, but the striking thing about them is the sheer amount of nothing. Nothing as far as the eye can see, and further still. It's nothing on such a vast scale it becomes compelling, but that's something games can often struggle with due to technical limitations. In action RPGs like this, it's particularly difficult, since you've only got about a few dozen square yards of vision when your camera's pointed squarely at the ground. The Utraean Peninsula campaign of the first game managed to do something interesting with this despite the limitations, by creating a zone that loops to the east and west, creating an infinitely vast zone to wander in and making the pyramids at its centre feel like an adventure to find. The Asianite Desert and the Plain of Tears feature no such trickery, however. The deserts are by far the blandest areas of the game, due both to their lack of visual interest and to them feeling the most contrived areas to limit you to a handful of linear paths. That said, it is at least still mechanically more fun than the end of the game. Dungeon Siege 2's ending very much exists in contradiction with itself. The narrative climax is actually very strong in a lot of ways, but it's let down by being mechanically frustrating. Not so much due to its own design, but due to the difficulty finally reaching a point where the lack of coherent control over your party finally becomes unbearable. The narrow corridors and large enemy ambushes of Zaramoth's Horns provide exactly the kinds of tactical opportunities that the mechanics won't let you deal with. You can't prioritise the right targets or control the battlefield in any way that you need to, leaving what could have been a strong mechanical climax to become a slog of irritating encounters that test your patience more than your skill. Only to culminate in two terrible boss fights. The Archmage is a more powerful variant of the Dark Wizard you fight earlier, once alone and then as a trio, but now you also need one of your party to rotate around the edge of the arena, stopping him from using the magical obelisks there against you and turning them to your advantage. This is something the controls will not allow you to do if you also want to avoid his area of effect attacks with the rest of your party. It has an awful, clunky rhythm, even more than previous boss fights, of getting a few hits in, then kiting your entire squad around the arena until you've turned enough of the obelisks to your side, and hopefully paused long enough to let your nature mage cast their healing magics, before returning for another few hits and repeating. Then you fight Valdis. His first phase is annoying because he can't be damaged, and you just have to deal with his numerous adds until he becomes vulnerable. In his second phase, it's even worse. While you can damage him, now the edges of the already too small arena are flooded in lava. Lava that he will repeatedly push you into with one of his shockwaves, leaving you to clumsily reposition your entire squad or just leave them to burn, because they won't move themselves out of the lava. I find it genuinely bizarre. The original game lacked any kind of complex boss fights, with slightly more involved ones being introduced in the expansion. The boss fights in the sequel feel like they would work really well with the original game's control scheme and party management systems, but they've been stripped out for a more streamlined approach that just doesn't work with the new encounters. The half-and-half attempt to hybridize party and solo systems end up being the worst of both worlds, leaving you with neither the focused control of the latter nor the tactical flexibility of the former, and in these last few areas, and this last fight in particular, that becomes most apparent. It's also where the new death mechanics are the most intrusive. Instead of simply reloading a save when your party wipes, now you resurrect back at town with none of your equipped items and a quarter of your gold missing. You can either give up that gold to get your equipment back straight away, or you can run back to your graves to retrieve your gear and keep the money. These kinds of death mechanics have recently been popularised by FromSoft's Souls games, and I like them about as much there as I do here. Having to drag your party, equipped or not, through a huge chunk of zone just to get back to the fight you're on is a huge pain, and the death run to Valdis is the longest and slowest in the game, hamstringing the game's pacing in its final hours. It seems a lot of these mechanical changes were made with the multiplayer in mind. You no longer have separate multiplayer and single-player characters, you can bring your character into either and back at will. This explains the changes to your choice of race, the difficulty systems, and the death mechanics. It even explains the new control scheme, since with less than a full squad, you can bring one or two companions as well, and two players controlling two characters each works a lot better with the new scheme. All of these changes have been made at the expense of the single-player experience, however, resulting in a weaker game overall. The final hours of the game being a frustrating mess is really sad since it's just when the narrative is picking up steam. Before entering Zaramoth's Horns for the final stretch, you take a quick detour to visit the Agalan Giants. Having created the shield in the first place, they're reluctant to reforge it since the last time the shield and the sword were together in the same place, the world almost got destroyed. You find that a medallion your friend gave you all the way back when you were working as a mercenary is actually a fifth piece of the shield. Its absence in the first shield was what led to its destruction, but with its inclusion, the Agalans believe this time the shield should work as intended. They're almost right. Reaching the second phase of Valdis, you find that the kindly scholar who's been helping you the entire game is in fact another of the Dark Wizards. They've been manipulating you, and Valdis, and Zaramoth before him, to their own ends. This reveal is well handled, surprising enough on its own, though heavily foreshadowed if you spend any time reading the additional lore books scattered throughout your journey. With his urging, the sword and shield meet once more, but this time it's the sword that is shattered, though with no less dire consequences for the world. The scholar flees, abandoning a now vulnerable Valdis for you to fight, before providing you with another portal to escape the collapsing fortress. The scholar's motivations are shrouded in mystery, which is far more interesting than Valdis' simple desire to rule the world, but what those motivations are won't be revealed until the expansion. I feel like I've been overly harsh towards Dungeon Siege 2 at times, but if I have, it's only because it's far more frustrating than its predecessor. Frustrating because so much has been improved and expanded upon, but the basic systems with which you navigate the world and engage in its combat have been stripped of their original uniqueness. They're left in an unpleasant state, trying to bridge two ideals in a way that has the advantages of neither. I want to engage with its world and the adventure it's providing, but every time I try to, the new systems make it impossible to perform anything but the most simple of actions. I want to treat these encounters as tactical engagements, and at times it feels like the game does too, but the controls won't let me do anything more complex than bunching all of my characters together, blobbing them at the enemy, and then hoping I'm not going to have to do a corpse run to mop up later. The expansion wouldn't improve upon these baseline mechanics, but it would at least continue the story of the scholar to its conclusion. Broken World is far more narratively dense than the base game, and yet also seemingly far more mechanically padded. The result is an expansion that manages to feel both too short and overlong at the same time. That said, the escalation of storytelling is worth the time spent on it, as it's a far more complex and fitting narrative conclusion to the threads left hanging by the end of the base campaign. A year has passed since you helped cause the Second Cataclysm. You and your companions have spent most of that time on the trail of the Scholar, now dubbed the Overmage, and the game picks up with your most promising lead yet. The Dryads, ousted from their home when the Cataclysm splintered the trees of their home city and sunk their island, have moved to the mainland. One of their outposts housing refugees has recently been facing trouble with out-of-control rogue mages. Sensing this may be the work of the Overmage, you set off to investigate. Broken World does an excellent job of selling how badly the Second Cataclysm damaged the world. You'll only visit a small sliver of the world, but everywhere you go the land is barren and corrupted. Forests still smoulder while jagged rock formations pockmark the landscapes. Reports of the lands you don't see paint a similar picture, with the northern marches and Snowbrook Haven barely surviving and Calrathia wiped off the map. It's the people who have changed the most, however. The Dryads were a thorny people even in the last game, and they've only become more hostile now. Which is fair in your case. You first met them when you were invading their home, and this time you're widely seen as the cause for the world ending a second time. But they aren't treating others much better. They accept refugees, but they don't seem too pleased about it, and are more than willing to bar entry from areas they deem too dangerous. The Dryads, it is revealed, were created during the First Cataclysm. With the second, a great leader has appeared among them, who they have rallied around. Of all the people of the world, the Dryads are the ones making the most obvious power moves, but their effort sits at an uncomfortable crossroads between benevolence and conquest. They aren't particularly happy about you helping with the recent rogue mage problem. With each one you defeat, they aren't far behind to absorb the power, and they're pretty annoyed at you for risking their chance to do so by getting in their way. The rogue mages also present one of the problems with the expansion. They're boss fights in a similar vein to the base game, with all the problems that entails, but instead of being one and done, you fight 3 identical bosses throughout the first part of the game, with only their damage numbers and health bars to differentiate them. This problem persists throughout. You never fight one version of a major enemy without fighting several more afterwards, which does make the game feel like it's vamping for time. There are a few minor mechanical changes, the addition of an NPC that lets you reassign your skill points, a more advanced crafting system that allows you to use the base game's enchanting to create specific powerful items, and most impactfully, a pair of new classes. Like with Legends of Aranna's quality of life updates, these new classes filter back to the base game if you have the expansion installed. In fact, I used one of them for my main character. The Nature Magic and Melee class, dubbed the Stone Fist, specialises in area of effect damage. Meanwhile, the Blood Assassin, a class that deals high damage at the expense of damaging themselves, is a combination of ranged and combat magic. The two classes add some interesting variety and, depending on how you distribute skill points between the three trees each has access to, adds many more possibilities to how you build characters. Unfortunately, they're still reliant on the same XP system that prioritises whichever weapon they have equipped. This means both have to rely heavily on weapon enhancements that forcefully split XP between their martial and magical experience pools. They're a good addition overall though, and each comes with a new companion with their own quest lines. The new characters fit into the party dynamic nicely, getting enough screen time to feel like considerable additions without overshadowing the original cast, who have developed and grown during their travels. The changes to the narrative focus are what really differentiate the expansion from the base campaign. The original's overarching plot about finding all the shield pieces was a passable way to move the action along, but wasn't particularly interesting until the very end. Here, the Overmage's plans are a mystery throughout much of the campaign, so while the overarching focus is on unpicking them, the game has more room to breathe in the moment-to-moment events as you establish whether they link into his plans, or are simply a consequence of your own actions. It doesn't affect the outcomes at all, but your character is given more room to answer in different ways during dialogue, giving you more room to inhabit the world and consider how your character is dealing with being the cause of the apocalypse. This even allows you to solve quests in a few manners, sometimes inconsequentially, like how you acquire a child's tears for your new Blood Assassin, sometimes more impactfully, like what's to be done about what remains of the Morden. Since Valdis's death, the Morden have all but fallen apart, literally in some cases. Only a few enclaves of them still exist, and you cross paths with two of them. One group have pledged themselves to the Overmage, but their new liege has led to some changes. They're even more bloodthirsty and vicious than before, but they're only being kept alive through applications of the Overmage's blood. Without it, they would end up like the group of Morden refugees. Weakened and slowly dying of some unknown disease, incapable of fighting, barely able to move, these Morden ask you for your mercy and request you seek the Dryad's help in providing them food. You can do so, or you can poison the food in an attempt to wipe them out entirely. The choice has no overarching effect, they're doomed to die either way, but it isn't meaningless. If you're willing to provide them with food, and then steal a vial of the blood that sustains their brethren, they use it to draw the Overmage to them and demand answers. There's no saving them. They were created by Valdis in much the same way Zaramoth created the Sec, but Valdis was never as powerful as his predecessor, and so with his death, his creations are withering away. The Morden accept this with dignity, if you let them, and elect to die on their own terms, with the sun on their back. It's an interesting and humanising moment, treating the Morden not as the tools their creators saw them as, nor as the mindless villains to be slaughtered in their hundreds, but as an actual people making what choices they can about what remains of their destiny. Seeing how the various races are reacting to the Cataclysm is one of the best parts of the expansion, but they aren't all handled with the same level of introspection as the Morden. The Vaikesh, that's Dark Elves remember, of the base game were something of a missed opportunity. There they had taken one of the parts of the shield, and were holding it in their stronghold, believing themselves to be its rightful owners. Their brief appearance managed to develop a sense of a unique culture, not evil or destructive in the way of the Morden, but simply very different. Their beliefs about life and death separates them from their more traditional elven counterparts, but there's never the sense these differences are insurmountable. It did devolve into violence, of course. They had the shield piece, you needed the shield piece, there wasn't really the time to put aside your cultural differences and find common ground, even if their self-styled prophet who led them had been open to persuasion, so violence was necessary to expedite the process. With the prophet dead and the world fractured, the Dark Elves of the expansion start making motions of peace towards the elves. They've rescued a member of one of their scouting parties, and saved the bodies of the others they couldn't help so that the death practices of the elves could be respected. The elves are suspicious of this, but are open to joint patrols in the surrounding woods in response. It could have been a really nice narrative beat about old enemies coming together in peaceful cooperation during times of strife. It could have been, but the game isn't satisfied to leave things there. It's later revealed that it was all a trick. The Dark Elves only did this to get those joint patrols in order to more easily abduct elves for their nefarious purposes. Seeing the Morden treated so even-handedly added depth and complexity to the world building, but here the game takes the cynic's approach that the Vikesh aren't some misunderstood and distinct culture that could come to be an ally in time. They were always evil, scheming bastards, and it's up to you to slaughter the lot of them. Taking advantage of the elves is a particularly low blow, given how they fared since the Second Cataclysm. From the burnt-out ruins of the recently meteored Amanlu of the previous game, the elves have retreated even further, now confined to just a handful of buildings with what remains of the city occupied by various creatures, but they've lost more than just their city. The elves have long had the gift of sight, giving them the ability to see both over great distances and across time. With the upheaval of magic, they've lost that ability and have fallen into despair. Some of them still fight, some even seek dangerous and ancient magics to try and fix things, but for most of them they're simply clinging to what little survival they have left. Your attempts to rouse the elves ultimately fail because of this. Seeing them so low would have made the beginnings of an alliance with the Manu Ostar a very powerful plot beat, making it doubly disappointing that it was undercut. It's worse that there didn't need to be another completely evil race hanging around to fill the gap of the Morden. The Vikesh could have been completely honest about their intentions to develop peace, and nothing would have been lost mechanically, since the major enemy of the expansion is already so good. The Familiars are an ancient enemy of the elves. They're alien, literally from some other plane of existence. It's unclear whether they came from the same place as the Overmage, were created by him long ago, or have simply allied with him out of convenience. The Familiars themselves do a good job of feeling otherworldly in their designs, but it's their minions that are the real stars of the expansion's bestiary. The Bound are a fantastic set of enemies, strong enough to support a full-length game, with the caveat that what makes them so effective is that they exist in the wake of an entire adventure getting used to its previous monsters. Created by familiar surgeons deep in their lairs, the Bound are a mishmash of various other enemies, monsters, and allies you faced in previous games. Now, however, they are mutilated, changed with metal grafted into their flesh. They're a genuinely nightmarish force, and all the more effective from having spent a game fighting against and alongside whatever they used to be. It makes for an effective and dramatic escalation that doesn't tire even on repeated assaults on the grisly catacombs and tombs where the surgeons perform their work. As fodder to be slain, they work excellently. They're a far more sinister and threatening enemy than any that have appeared previously, but you're also definitely doing them a favour putting them out of their misery, which makes their wanton slaughter still feel heroic without ethical complications. The Overmage is still your primary concern, and disrupting his objectives your primary goal. To give him his full name, however, he is the Overmage of the Sinbri, because, like the Sek, and the Malgin, and the Shadow Jumper, Broken World is about a great threat that was or is locked away, and you need to stop them. It's a shame the Overmage's plan falls back onto a repetition of earlier themes, since up until the reveal his unclear motivations were compelling. They still are to a point. It's not uncommon for villains to wax poetic about how they're doing the right thing and working for the greater good, but it's unusual for one to be so convincing about it. Despite his appearance and the whole working to bring about the Cataclysm thing, the lore does suggest that life under Zaramoth was prosperous for its people, if vicious in its application of the law. The Overmage is charismatic enough that for about the first half of the expansion I still found some doubt in the back of my mind that he might be right. Maybe he is fighting for a worthwhile end and just has an overactive ability to justify the means. Of course, by the time you realise he's directly working with or responsible for the gore-encrusted sepulchres of the familiar surgeons, that doubt is wiped out. as is the doubt that the Dryad's new great leader could be anyone other than him in disguise. Despite their methods, the Dryads are genuinely trying to put the world right. They're just doing it with the same heavy-handed approach to justice and lack of consideration for others that Zaramoth had. They're also being tricked into funneling the magical energy they've collected towards the Overmage. They realise their mistake far too late, with only a few surviving the ordeal. The magic is needed to reopen the portal to the Sinbree's home dimension. They're sustained by magic, but their own world is almost devoid of it. Aranna is overflowing with it, and so they're attempting to relocate. 1,000 years ago, at the time of the first cataclysm, they almost managed to enter, but the Dark Wizards were busy aiding Zaramoth, and an overconfident Overmage failed to sustain the portal between worlds, trapping him and his brothers in Aranna. Driven by his previous failure, the Overmage has spent the last 1,000 years planning and brought about the second cataclysm to bring the magic of the world closer to the surface. Naturally, you need to stop him. I've got some misgivings about the mechanical pacing of Broken World. As strong as the previous sections are, they can be a little repetitive. The final sequences are far stronger, however. First, the rediscovery of the dwarves. A dwarven mine went missing in this part of the world some few hundred years back, and it's revealed they were captured by the Overmage and forced to re-excavate the city created ready for the Sinbree's arrival. Aiding them in rebelling against their overseers is a very strong segment, well-paced and not outstaying its welcome. Each of its side objectives not just keeping to the rhythm of the sequence, but also adding support to your future battles, enhancing the feeling of being at the head of a revolt. It harkens back to the Snowbrook Haven and Calrathia sections of the main campaign, but truncated significantly to eliminate downtime. The Sinbree City 2 is an improvement. It's effectively what Zaramoth's Horns should have been. Large areas give you more room to maneuver, while larger and more powerful enemies combined with far weaker, smaller enemies make prioritising targets while using area of effect powers to clear out the chaff a tactical challenge that is better suited to the game's controls. The same can't quite be said about the final boss though. The first phase of the Overmage, where you fend off waves of enemies and then damage him in between, works relatively well, but his second phase features all the same problems as the base game's boss fights. It's a pain of an encounter that takes far longer than it should due to the difficulty of controlling your party, rather than the difficulty of the boss itself. The fact that he uses a range of more powerful versions of the class abilities you have access to is nice, making it easier to understand what he's doing at any given moment, since it's what you've been doing the whole game. But it's not enough to actually leave the game on a mechanical high. It does, however, take time during the credits to treat the player to a series of ending slides. These have been something of a staple in RPGs for some time now, taking a brief moment after the game to detail the effects of your choices and what your companions went on to do. Broken Worlds are limited to a few sentences detailing what your party went on to achieve in the wake of the Overmage's defeat, but it's still a welcome touch. They've always been such a simple but effective element of RPG design, letting the game's narrative slowly fade rather than ending abruptly. It's the same effect as reading Appendix B of The Lord of the Rings, far less detailed than the parts of the narrative you were there to see, but giving the player time to slowly leave the world behind, rather than being yanked out of it as soon as the story is over. Gas-powered games would also leave Aranna behind after Broken World. Lead designer Chris Taylor would go on to consult on Dungeon Siege 3, and the studio would play something of a supporting role for the next game we're going to talk about, but for the most part they moved on to new projects. Gas-powered games was started by Taylor and several other alumni of Cavedog Entertainment, whose major claim to fame was the classic real-time strategy Total Annihilation. After Dungeon Siege, Gas-Powered would return to these roots to release that game's truest and most worthy successor in the shape of Supreme Commander. The world of Aranna would continue, however, but it would be much changed, most notably in the next game by being presented in teeny-weeny squinter-vision. I've always had a soft spot for the PlayStation Portable. Sitting somewhere between the first two PlayStations in terms of power allowed it to tackle more ambitious titles than was typical of handhelds at the time, and beyond that its relative power and ease of soft modding made it a great device for running homebrew software and emulating retro consoles. Its successor, the Vita, improved upon it in many ways, including making it more powerful and adding a second analog stick, but sadly it never got the support from developers or homebrewers to make it worthwhile. These days handhelds in the form of the Switch and Steam Deck are more in line with their larger counterparts and capable of equivalent experiences, while the market handhelds used to cater to, younger or more casual players, have mostly moved over to phones. Naturally, the circumstances of its existence were going to have significant effects on Throne of Agony. Being on a console far weaker than the desktops of its predecessors, and one with a grand total of 12 buttons and a single analog stick, changes were going to have to be made to the formula. It's impressive then that Throne of Agony does a good job of feeling like a complementary inclusion in the Dungeon Siege canon, despite the sacrifices necessary to shrink it down to the PSP. Real-time controls and a large party would be impossible to combine, even with the simplified approach of Dungeon Siege 2. As such, one of them had to go, and it's the party. Switching to a single character and giving the player more direct control over them was the right choice to maintain the game's status as an action RPG. The game does feature companions, including Princess Ava and Tar, who returned from Dungeon Siege 2 to muddy the waters as to the game's timeline a little. You'll gather a small cadre of companions along your adventure, but there's nothing like the narrative impact of Dungeon Siege 2. Most of them have short quests attached to them, but like the original, little to no interaction once they're in your party. You can have one active at any time, and while in theory they have a variety of roles from healers to tanks, in reality their only role is to die so often you eventually stop using them entirely, once you become powerful enough to manage without them. You start out with one of two companions, your choice being dependent on which of the three characters you're playing as. Instead of the more open approach of its PC counterparts, Throne of Agony has you select your character at the start. Alistair, Morgrim, and Seren all have their own reasons for travelling to the Broken Lands, as well as their own class and skills, roughly falling into the mage, warrior, and thief archetypes respectively. There's some flexibility within each character, splitting into one of two subclasses partway through the game, with each splitting into a further pair of sub-subclasses briefly after the start of your second playthrough, if you choose to do one. Seren, for example, excels in ranged combat or dual wielding, with her further specialising into one of the two when she switches classes at level 30. Regardless of your class choice, however, your gameplay is going to look rather similar. You'll struggle a little at first, find a few skills that are broken to sink points into, and be carving your way through enemies with reckless abandon by the end, if not far earlier. It's not a particularly difficult game, nor a particularly punishing one when you do die, but this isn't something I'd call a drawback. As a game on a handheld console, its target audience hews a little younger, and even ignoring that, its target gameplay experience tends to have a more casual and relaxed nature, with shorter play sessions envisioned. The game features a large number of dungeons, but they'll rarely last more than 20 to 30 minutes, even at their longest. Smaller, more bite-sized sessions are the focus, and this works well. It's easier to blow through a huge number of shorter dungeons if you've got more time than expected, than to slowly inch your way through larger dungeons if your playtime is limited. Of course, another thing the hardware shift had to do away with was the large interconnected world. Instead, these dungeons are instanced and separated from one another, but scattered within an overworld. I'm a big fan of this choice. There could have just as easily been a map menu to select from, but being able to wander around maintains the sense of a cohesive adventure that was so central to the appeal of the first game. It's a great bit of presentation, a little low in detail perhaps, but a charming way to maintain the feel of the older games under new constraints, and the floating text to emulate a map is a delightful little touch. This style of overworld travel was popularised by JRPGs, with the one here seeming most inspired by the early 3D ones such as Final Fantasy VII's. I have to admit, I've never been super into JRPGs. I like them conceptually, applaud their tendency to focus on larger and more complex narratives, but I just can't get along with the specific style of menu-focused turn-based combat they tend to use. It's nice then to see these kinds of overworlds that I'm so fond of used within different genres. It's a great way of distributing content, both allowing the designer to restrict the player's access to later areas, while still making it easy to access anything they might have missed as they progress along their adventure, all without disconnecting the player from the character's journey. Why the characters are on this journey is a big part of choosing which character to play as. I didn't really want to make the same mistake as I did in Dungeon Siege 2, where I felt like I picked the wrong race. To Throne of Agony's credit, all three seem to have some claim to the position of main character. All of them are drawn to the Broken Lands, but I feel like I chose the wrong one. Alistair is a battle mage of the 10th Legion back in Ebb. His partner, Cedra, left following visions of an artifact and disappeared. He abandoned his post in order to follow her. Mogrim is a half-giant. Ever since the Second Cataclysm a few years before the start of the game, he, like all half-giants apparently, has felt the markings on his skin drawing him to the Broken Lands. Seren, on the other hand, is an elf who, unlike her kinsfolk, didn't lose her visions in the Cataclysm. She's still receiving them and has been seeing a great evil rising in the north. I figured Alistair was out of the running as the motivation of searching for his lost love seems rather generic. As the only character for whom the Throne of Agony, the namesake of the game, appears in their intro, and given her seeming importance as the only elf to retain her vision in the wake of the Second Cataclysm, I assumed Seren would be the best choice. Like I said, I think this was the wrong choice. The mysterious markings and tattoos that adorn the half-giants were brought up in lore books of the second game, but Throne of Agony will focus on the mystery of the half-giants more closely than any other narrative thread, which seems to make Mogrim the most natural choice for a main character. The others don't feel unsatisfying, and the overarching plot remains the same regardless of which you choose, but it certainly seems like Mogrim's connection to it make his journey the most narratively impactful of the three. Reaching the Broken Lands, an archipelago to the north that was called that long before the Second Cataclysm, the game will be broadly split into 3 sections. Funnily enough, though, this doesn't line up with the game's 3 acts. Firstly, facing the Dark Druid in the Sunken Forest, then defending the Citadel of Dran from the Vega hordes that are attacking it, before finally raising the ancient Agalan capital from the depths of the ocean and defeating Malith, the villain behind it all. Each segment is broken up into smaller pieces of the world, and each of them has its own rhythm. While some feature a strictly linear approach, with quests sending you from one dungeon to the next, others will give you several at once to hit in any order you choose, or send you to a handful in order while leaving the rest entirely optional. It's a good system. Just the simple shift in approach throughout keeps the game from feeling too repetitive, which is always a risk with action RPGs, where the combat can start to get stale after a while. I never found the combat got stale, but I did find it kind of wonky at times, mostly due to the difficulty curve. It's a little all over the place, not just in terms of becoming too powerful as the game goes on, but on a dungeon by dungeon basis too. You'd expect every dungeon you're sent to would be a higher level than the last, but this sometimes wasn't the case, even during the more linear sequences of quests. Stranger still, how much of any given dungeon you're required to complete for a quest seems completely arbitrary. For some, it requires you reach the very end, defeat a boss, or even pass through to the next area. Others, especially early, can see you completing their associated quests in the first room, having barely stuck your head in. You won't want to leave as soon as it's over though, since early on you need the experience to avoid falling even further behind the leveling curve, but later, when you've become overly powerful, you're more likely to need to complete much more of the dungeon to proceed. The leveling curve is particularly strange. Levels come gradually through the first part of the game, but somewhere around the midpoint, suddenly enemy XP drops increase massively, considerably faster than the amount of XP needed to level up. After 6 hours of playing, I was just past level 20, and was facing large numbers of enemies several levels higher. By hour 8, I was almost level 50, hadn't faced an enemy higher than me since hour 7, and wouldn't for the rest of the game. The difficulty curve of the enemies is relatively steady throughout, with a few minor hiccups, but the player's power curve feels completely disconnected from it, jumping massively midway through as you suddenly get inundated with levels and work out which skills are the most overpowered for your particular class. The three sections of the game do a good job of growing steadily in scope, though the PSP is limited in its ability to really do this scale justice at times. The narrative threat grows steadily from a single Dark Druid to the people he came from to the god they worship, but the hardware is limited in its ability to reach the size and scale of combat the earlier games could. As such, it's more focused on smaller scale fights. You aren't defending the walls of Dran as you did Snowbrook Haven, instead you're sent out on expeditionary raids to weaken opposing forces elsewhere, which works well as a compromise to support the story beat. This also allows a good sense of variety in the areas you'll explore. There's a range of dungeons and tombs, fortresses and temples, with a variety of biomes too, from the forests and deserts of the mainland to the jungles and icebergs in the outlying islands. These are presented about as well as you can expect from the limited processing power, but it doesn't feel a million miles away from the other games. The visual design feels familiar if simplified, and when it introduces new elements they still feel in keeping with what came before. You get to see a lot more ancient Agarlan ruins this time around. In Dungeon Siege 2 you got to visit their council, which you do again here, albeit smaller, and with several members missing. The areas you visit in Throne of Agony expand upon the architecture laid out there. In their first appearance, the Agarlans were a seeming hybrid of Norse and Greek architecture, but now a little Aztec and Egyptian has been thrown into the mix, with a greater focus on the advanced magics that underpinned it all. The aesthetic is rather Atlantean, if you catch my meaning, a hodgepodge of ancient civilizations, yet still advanced in ways we can't fully grasp. The visual design throughout connects it well to the earlier games, but in terms of presentation it's the sound design that connects it most strongly. If you're like me and you played the original Dungeon Siege, there are a number of enemy audio cues seared into your mind. The skeletons, Krug, and especially the wolves of that game had particularly identifiable sounds associated with them, and many of those are replicated in Throne of Agony. This reuse, combined with the visual aesthetic, really grounds the game as being part of the same series, despite the mechanical differences. All of this is helped immensely by the reuse of music from earlier games to really cement it as belonging alongside its peers. Which brings us to something I was desperately trying to avoid. The music in the first two Dungeon Siege games, and again here, is really good. Unfortunately, it was created by Jeremy Soule. Soule is a veteran composer, best known for his work on the Elder Scrolls series, but has worked on a vast number of very well-known soundtracks over the years. If you've played games for any length of time, chances are you've played something he has worked on, especially if you're a fan of RPGs. In 2019, certain allegations were made against Soule, since which very little has been heard from him. I don't want to derail this video by diving into the specifics, nor is it my place to litigate the veracity of such allegations. All I shall say on the matter is that I believe the allegations, and their specifics have significantly tainted my ability to connect with Soule's work. It's genuinely quite impressive that a handheld game still manages to evoke the feel of its more complex counterparts in terms of its visuals and audio, but it's equally impressive that Throne of Agony also manages to feel like a cohesive part of Dungeon Siege's setting. It's clearly a smaller side story, but perhaps that's for the best. The war between the Agarlans and the Utgard giants was an important part of Dungeon Siege 2's lore, but was never really expanded upon beyond them being the creators of the shield and sword that featured so prominently in that game's lore. The disappearance of the Agarlans and their seeming refusal to help Azunai beyond the creation of the shield was always a mystery. These are the threads Throne of Agony decides to pull upon. It all comes down to the game's villain, Malith. She was on the Agarlan Council at the time of Azunai's uprising, but she was secretly in league with Zaramoth. While the Agarlan king was aiding Azunai from afar during his final battle, Malith struck a blow against him. With his dying breath, the king set a curse upon Malith and killed the councillors who had supported her. Malith was bound to the throne in the Agarlan capital, and as the first cataclysm shook the world, the floating capital fell from the sky and sank beneath the sea, with Malith still trapped inside. Since then, she has been working from the Throne of Agony to regain her power by adjusting the flow of magic throughout the land, and with the second cataclysm she has been able to draw in more and more power, and may soon break free. Whatever the reason for coming to the Broken Lands, it's your job to stop her now. As narratively evocative as this final confrontation is, the actual boss fight is a little weak, as is the moral dilemma that follows. At least for some of the characters. If you're playing as Alistair or Seren, the choice is obvious. While the game tries to imply claiming the now empty throne for yourself might lead to your goal, it's an obvious lie. The soul of Alistair's lover has become bound to the throne, and so claiming it does unite them once more, but breaking it also frees her soul and returns her to life. Meanwhile, Seren believes that claiming the throne may allow her to further trap and limit Malith's influence, but in truth it will simply allow Malith more influence over her. Destroying the throne sunders Malith's power completely, finally ending the visions she's been sending to Seren. In both cases, it couldn't be more obvious that sitting on something called the Throne of Agony is a very bad idea indeed, and that destroying it is the right move. This is where Mogrim's status as the true main character really shows through. There's an extra wrinkle in the plot for him. The Half-Giants, it turns out, are descended from other Agarlans who supported Malith. They were stripped of their memories of their heritage, and to this day follow strange practices even they don't understand. The Half-Giants can be redeemed, however, returned to their former power and forgiven for supporting Malith, but it requires one of them kill Malith and take her place on the throne as penance. This shifts the choice to one of self-sacrifice. Either redeem the rest of your people, returning something they felt the loss of but couldn't articulate for so long, or refuse the cost and doom them to exist as they do now. It's a significantly more difficult choice, and it's a shame the others didn't face an equally compelling ending. Like the Ukraine Peninsula campaign, I went back and forth on whether or not to do a full playthrough of Throne of Agony. I'm glad I did. Despite being a smaller, less important side story in the grand scheme of things, it's a well-integrated and mostly well-executed game that fits well with the rest of the series. The extra lore expands upon the setting in a way that feels natural, and presents a narrative that very well could have been an expansion of the PC games instead. It also serves another interesting role within the series. It acts as a far better mechanical bridge to Dungeon Siege 3. Fans of the series more or less rejected Dungeon Siege 3 when it launched. In fairness, I was one of them. I played for about an hour, found it to be a rather generic action RPG that had sacrificed everything interesting about the original in the name of appealing to a console audience, so I dropped it. When I started this project, I was expecting to find much the same, and to spend much of this segment lamenting how the series had lost its way. Instead, I found it may well be my favourite game in the series. While mechanically it feels more like a sequel to Throne of Agony, narratively it's firmly set in continuity with the first game. Kind of. Aside from the existence of Azunai and the church that worships him, the game more or less ignores everything about Dungeon Siege 2. The second cataclysm is never mentioned, the events of that game never referenced. While it does frequently reference the events of the first game, even there the timelines don't actually connect properly. I'm not one to hold that against it though. The creation of a cohesive and coherent setting in fantasy is often seen as necessary, but it is only really a nicety. As a standalone work, Dungeon Siege 3 details what is necessary from the previous games, and lets the rest remain unspoken. The important details are this. Around 150 years after the event of the first game, the 10th Legion that held so much power in Ebb has fallen. Following the death of Ebb's king, a woman named Jane Cassinda appeared. She spread word that the Legion was responsible for the king's death, that they had murdered him and placed his more malleable son on the throne instead. The people believed her. She quickly rose to power within the Azunite Church, rallied the people behind her, and began a crusade against the Legion. Across Ebb, Legion's strongholds fell one by one, until few remained. In the final days of the war, the Grand Master Hugh Montbaron, grandson of the Lady Montbaron, who is the canonical identity of the hero of Ebb from the first game, gathered the remaining leaders of the Legion and entered the ancient forest of the Mournweald. Jane followed them in, and only she emerged. 30 years have passed since then, during which Cassinda has continued her crusade, hunting any remaining children of the Legion while warring against the royalist forces that support the now Queen Rosalind in a civil war to take control of Ebb. You play as one of 4 characters, Children of the Legion, as you attempt to rebuild the 10th Legion and face off against Jane Cassinda's tyranny. Unlike Throne of Agony, there seems to be little question as to who is intended as the main character. Lucas Montbaron is the son of Hugh Montbaron, the fighter of the group, and is the only one who doesn't join you at a fixed point in the game if you aren't playing as him. If you're playing as someone else, he'll join you as a companion when they would have instead. He's the most generic and obviously heroic of the lot, but when I first came to this conclusion I certainly wasn't giving the game enough credit. The others are all connected to the Legion as well, though in lesser ways. The mage Reinhardt is the grandson of Merrick, Legion Grand Mage and companion in the first game. Katarina is also a child of Hugh Montbaron, an illegitimate daughter born of a dalliance with a Lasconzi witch, a sort of Romany-coded travelling people. Finally there's Anjali. She's the only one who isn't actually related to a Legion member, instead she is an Archon, a rare fire-wielding being said to have served the creator gods in times long past. She was found as an infant and raised by Odo, the legionnaire who first begins the process of rebuilding the Legion. His plan to rebuild the Legion backfires terribly. You open the game late to his secret meeting to find the location burning and mercenaries swarming the estate. It's a weak start, a slow one too, despite the fact you start the game desperately trying to escape a burning mansion. The game won't tip its hand that there's actually engaging narrative elements present for a few hours, and until then you're stuck with admittedly rather bland combat. There's nothing wrong with it, it's fine, but it wouldn't have been enough to hang the entire game on. It's serviceable, if slightly finicky, regardless of whether you're using a mouse and keyboard or a controller. It also features the same issues Throne of Agony did, starting rather weak and then suddenly tipping into being wildly overpowered once you figure out a few broken skills. The game has a weird issue with its enemies too. For a fantasy game, especially one that had so many different enemy types in earlier games, there's a surprising lack of monsters. A few undead, plenty of spiders, but beyond those, the vast majority of enemies are humans with the occasional goblin. Later, when those humans are the Asianite zealots of Jane's army, that doesn't cause any issues, but there are some problems early on. For the bulk of the first section, you'll be fighting Lascanzi mercenaries, the people Katarina is descended from. There's an unbalanced narrative surrounding them. In the real world, the Romani and other travelling communities are and have long been subject to discrimination and deep-seated prejudices. The Lascanzi of Ebb are treated much the same, seen as suspicious and greedy by settled folks, and often viewed with great superstition. The narrative does try to humanise them. There are several Lascanzi who actively help you, and later backstory is given to show that they have reason to be far more hostile than they actually are, having been driven from their homeland by the Empire of Stars. Despite all these attempts to give them a more well-rounded and balanced presentation, they're still an overwhelmingly destructive force with a proclivity for strange magics. It narratively attempts to sidestep the issues that the gameplay still walks into. There's not enough done to subvert the stereotypes so common to these types of groups in-game. The second major group you fight faces much the same problem. The Urshamesh, or to give them their far more racially charged name, the First People, are a tribal community living out in the swamp. They're called savages by the royalists you're helping at the time, but instead of subverting that, the narrative leans into it in many ways. Beyond simplistic patterns of speech and aesthetic design, they're also shown to be so xenophobic and isolationist that they'd rather bind the souls of their dead to the shrunken heads displayed around their village than risk their souls mixing with other races in the afterlife. Again, the narrative tries to humanise them by showing them as victims of the violence around them, not its source, but you'll still carve your way through their village by force before they finally stop fighting you and accept your superior strength. Despite falling into many rather lazy stereotypes, however, I am willing to cut the game some slack here. While I don't think it quite works, there's definitely a sense that these groups are being used deliberately not as executors of violence, but as victims of a cycle of violence instead. Like the Droog before, there's a sense that many of the enemies in Dungeon Siege 3 are not aggressors striking first, but rather groups responding to aggression levied against them in the past. The Lascunzi are forced into mercenary work as their homeland was taken from them, and they're too ostracised by society to find any other work. The First People have long found their home being used as a battleground by other groups, who have destroyed the land they see as sacred. Each group is in some way justified in the violence they're now committing, but while the narrative will pay lip service to this, it isn't going to stop you killing huge numbers of them. In fact, the nature of the game encourages it. I'm willing to give these representations a little more grace than perhaps they deserve at times, due to the clear intention to more nuanced and morally complex storytelling the game aspires towards. Being offered choices isn't uncommon in RPGs, but it's significantly rarer in the kinds of action RPGs that Dungeon Siege 3 patterns itself after. It was being presented with one of these choices that first clued me in the game might be something more than a simplistic dungeon crawler. An early side quest has you entering Gunderic Manor. The Grand Estate used to belong to a family of the 10th Legion, an accomplished lineage of mages, and acted as the training ground for many of the Legion's magic users. The dungeon itself is a decent self-contained adventure. The final owner of the manor, having fallen into grief after the death of his wife, bound his daughter's soul to a magical artifact in order to keep her from death. Naturally, this led to the mansion becoming infested with the undead and sealed by the Legion. Working your way through the manor while the spirit of the daughter guides you to unlock its secrets is a pretty standard if well presented module, but at the end you're offered a series of choices. Destroying the artifact that the girl is bound to will free her, at the expense of empowering her father who still haunts its halls and acts as the module's final boss. Another layer is added when you decide what to do with the place. You were first sent into the manor by Leona, a friendly Lascunzi witch and long-lost sister of Katarina. Whether you claim the now cleansed manor in the name of the Legion, or grant it to Leona, isn't an easy choice. You don't have the manpower to occupy the place now, but it may be useful later. At the same time, you don't really want to be making more enemies right now, so maybe avoiding the conflict would be preferable, and Leona could prove a staunch ally. The decision won't have a great deal of effect on the game. Mechanically it only alters the minor stat buff completing the chain gives you, but the inclusion of the choice prompts the player to more seriously engage with the game and its world, asking them to consider more carefully what they're doing and how they're impacting the world as they pass through it. Other choices have more of an impact, mind you. The initial sequence of the game is focused on defeating whoever hired the Lascunzi mercenaries who hunt you. This is revealed to be a woman named Rajani. She's an Archon like your companion Anjali, and unsurprisingly is in the service of Jane Cassinda. You'll definitely have Anjali with you when you face her, as she's the first companion you gain if you aren't playing as her, which serves as a good plot hook as to the mysteries of Anjali's past. Defeating Rajani leaves you with a choice: kill her, imprison her, or let her go. She's absolutely guilty of having occupied the local village of Raven's Rill. Her mercenaries have caused a great deal of trouble for the local people, and the boyar who leads the village wants her executed. But that's exactly what she expects you to do, because it's what Jane expects you to do. Executing Rajani will confirm everything Jane has been saying about the Legion these past 30 years, but if you spare her, maybe that will show the people you aren't the monsters you've been made out to be. It might even open the doors to peace down the line. The decision to spare or execute Rajani will reverberate throughout the game, more so than most other choices. Not to a game-altering degree, it won't open new quests or diverge the story, but it will alter the texture and outcome of various scenes right up until the end of the game. It's far more narrative agency than I was expecting, more than I think I've ever experienced with another action RPG. This is what drew me into the story more than anything else, the realisation that it wasn't just going to be something to hang the action from, but rather it wanted to be taken seriously in its own right. I was surprised by this, but in retrospect I shouldn't have been. Something I'd failed to really clock the first time I played it and put it down years ago was who developed the game. I saw it wasn't the original developers and, like many, dismissed it as the new publisher Square Enix having done a quick cash grab to profit off of the name. Quick cash grabs aren't really in Obsidian Entertainment's wheelhouse. Obsidian are veteran developers of RPGs. It was originally formed of ex-Black Isles employees shortly before its closure. Black Isles were a subsidiary of Interplay, responsible for publishing the original Baldur's Gate trilogy, as well as developing other Infinity Engine RPGs such as Planescape Torment and Icewind Dale. They even worked on Fallout 2, and to a lesser extent the original. These days Obsidian continue to be known for their RPGs, such as Pillars of Eternity, Tyranny, and The Outer Worlds, but even at the time of Dungeon Siege 3's release, they'd already developed Fallout New Vegas and Knights of the Old Republic 2, games which still regularly top various best-of lists to this day. Dungeon Siege 3 certainly isn't the most ambitious or expansive game they've developed, but even the worst Obsidian games can claim a high watermark of quality. The expertise and personality of this studio are on display throughout, both in the seriousness of its writing and paradoxically in its sense of humour. Having decided the fate of Rajani and made your way through the swamps of the Urshamesh, you return to Stonebridge to reclaim the Legion's Grand Chapter House. From here the game opens up, presenting 2 major quests to be completed in whichever order you choose, 3 if you also own the DLC. The one that keeps you in Stonebridge is an excellent example of Obsidian's propensity for combining humour and political commentary. You're tasked with building support within Stonebridge, namely by getting the city's ruling council to agree to an alliance against Jane's army. The city's seen a huge range of changes since the Lady Montbaron passed through in the first game. Since then, the goblins, once hated enemies, have officially been recognised as citizens of Ebb. Stonebridge was one of the few places to actively encourage their integration, and it's been reaping the benefits ever since. The technology of the goblins has grown from wood-plated tanks to ornate metalwork, and in turn the city has grown into the largest and most prosperous in the kingdom, even if it now sees itself as an independent republic. It's advanced past the medieval age, and has borne witness to something of a steampunk revolution. The city's security is ensured by automatons, while power and production facilities are generated by the great foundry beneath. The streets are filled with wealthy residents in their finery that make Katarina's busty cropped corsets only seem slightly out of place. They are also of course filled with weird little guys. The goblins remain the most overtly comedic element of the setting, but their presence doesn't undercut the tone as much as you might expect. This is because while they may give you a quest in a silly voice, the content of that quest is still treated seriously. Stonebridge presents many opportunities to show how the Legion will act as an organisation rather than a loose-knit group of adventurers, and it does so by presenting a classic collection of RPG activities. Not just the dungeon crawling to investigate the stolen automatons in the sprawling crypts, but also less violent pastimes, such as settling land disputes, or deciding the fate of a prisoner who have committed no crime, but may be in danger should they be released. These usually boil down to a 3-pronged choice, siding with one of the 2 parties, or to take a middle path, a compromise that neither is fully happy about. In true Obsidian fashion, however, the game will call you a coward under its breath if you pick the middle path. The scope of the game does limit the degree to which you can influence or approach events, however. There isn't a huge range of options or factions that something like Fallout New Vegas provides. You don't get to choose whether or not you help break the Cyclops' strike in the Foundry, but once you realise you're being used as low-grade Pinkertons, you can choose how the strike ends, whether the Cyclopses are forced back to work, or if they're given a wage and a day off occasionally instead. While solving the city's problems in order to get enough noble votes to secure an alliance, it's gradually revealed that many of the incidents are being shaped by a mysterious criminal figure, the Dapper Gent. While you can tackle the problems in any order, it's still an ultimately linear sequence, with the Gent prematurely unleashing his assault on the city once you've completed them all. Like the Laskanzi and the Urshamesh, the actions of the Gent are responses to violence committed against him. When Jane turned the people against the Legion, Stonebridge turned its ire on the chapter house there. The Legionnaires were ordered not to harm the citizens, and so refused to defend themselves as the townsfolk slaughtered them. All but one. Like in Dungeon Siege 2, the world is not the completely interconnected single space of the first game, but the teleportation network that allows you access to other areas is not simply a choice from a list. The Causeway network is a series of portals created by the Legion, allowing you to walk between major areas on pathways high above the broken remains of another world. The Gent was a survivor of the Stonebridge chapter house who hid within these causeways. In the years since, he's been slowly plotting, using the network to move as he pleases, hiding in plain sight, all the while working to turn the city's own automatons against them in revenge for the murder of his compatriots. You foil his plan, naturally, but it still leaves the question of what's to be done with him. The people want him tried, which will inevitably lead to his execution, but the Legion is short on allies, mages especially, and the Gent is a most powerful mage. Again, the game presents difficult choices. The Gent has done wrong, but in response to having been wronged. To save his life seems to ignore the harm he's caused, but finishing the job that the people of Stonebridge began 30 years ago hardly seems like justice. Given the complexity and consideration that the game provides its minor villains, it's no surprise that Jane herself is the most complex and detailed of all. We're going to take a quick detour before talking about her though. A quick visit to the Aranna Desert far in the north. The Treasures of the Sun DLC doesn't quite fit into the game as naturally as it needed to, both narratively and mechanically. There's never really a point in the narrative where it makes sense to play it, but it becomes available after you reclaim the Stonebridge chapter house, and effectively acts as a third module to be completed in the order of your choosing, alongside the Meisters of Stonebridge and the Glitterdelve mines. The problem is, while those both seem like rather urgent issues to be dealt with, the diversion to the Aranna Desert to discover the fate of an old legionnaire feels like something that could wait till later. Mechanically, the DLC throws off the power curve by quite a bit. Previously, you'd reach max level around the time you had completed Stonebridge and Glitterdelve, but with the DLC, you'll reach that same level of power by completing 2 of the 3 modules. It adds 5 additional levels, but that just means for the third module and for the final sequence, you'll have better stats and more skill points than you were meant to at that point, making the end of the game rather easier than intended. It also introduces a trio of ultimate abilities. You have a choice of a powerful heal, a temporary shield, or to cause massive area of effect damage. They use up all of the power used to enhance your regular abilities, and are a reasonably good addition to your toolset, unless you've built your character around building that power quickly, like I did. This leads to a situation where you can be repeatedly throwing out high damage blasts that can wipe out entire waves of enemies with only a few moments between activations. You know an ability is badly balanced when you're actively avoiding using it, because doing so trivializes combat to the point of boredom. Despite this, and the fact there's no point in the plot where this doesn't feel like you're ignoring far more pressing matters, the game still benefits greatly from the DLC's presence. Dungeon Siege 3's overall structure is unusual for action RPGs, but is a familiar one for more classic RPGs. The format was popularised by BioWare, and it features in games such as Dragon Age Origins and both Knights of the Old Republic games. Broadly speaking, a long linear introductory sequence leads into a choice of separate modules during the mid-game. Then once you've completed all of them, you proceed down a second linear sequence towards the end. It's a good, solid structure to build an RPG around, broadly aligning to a basic 3-act structure. In Act 1, you introduce the plot and give the player all the tools they need for the game. Act 2 takes up most of the game while giving the player freedom to approach tasks in whatever order they choose, before finally bringing everything together for the final act. Dungeon Siege 3 attempts this, but struggles with the lack of content in that middle segment. With only Glitterdelve and Stonebridge, it feels a little anemic, and the option of which to do first feels like an unnecessary addition. Treasures of the Sun bulks out this segment of the game, giving it a more well-rounded sense of pacing that would have been improved further through better integration. On its own, however, the DLC is a solid independent adventure. You're sent on the trail of Etienne Domani, a Legion commander who was also thought to have died in the Stonebridge chapter house, but actually travelled north, out of Ebb, and towards the Aranna Desert. Following him north, you come to an Azanite monastery, and are tasked with opening and delving into the vault beneath where his trail ends. The DLC ties into the lore of Dungeon Siege 2 far more than the base game. The peak of this is the ancient ruins of an Azanite temple, abandoned when the members of the temple relinquished the faith and became heretics. There's a dungeon in the base game, the Hero's Crypt, which acts as something of a monument to the original game. It's where the Lady Montbaron and her 14 companions, all of the heroes of the Sequesurgence, were buried. Within are the tombs of every companion of the original game, a short epitaph, and various other details discussing the lives of those characters both during and after the events of that game. Alas, poor Norik is there too. You knew him as the farmer who dies warning you of the Krug at the outset of the game, and his skull is kept in a reliquary on site in honour of his sacrifice. The Hero's Crypt is a great nod for veterans of the series, while also quickly catching new players up to speed on the background of the first game. The Azionite Temple acts much the same for the second, detailing the very basics of who Azionai was, the importance of his shield, and the founding of his church. It doesn't go into nearly as much detail as the second game did, naturally, and in fact there remain several elements that continue to contradict established lore, but as I've established, I don't consider that a problem, merely an observation. That Azionite Temple, along with a few others, makes up just over half of the DLC, with the remainder being delving into the vault beneath the monastery. The monastery is currently occupied by non-heretical Azionites, but this far from Ebb, they aren't particularly worried about the war going on back home. In fact, they aren't particularly supportive of Jane at all, so there's no conflict with them. But the original inhabitants of the monastery are still in the vault, and none too pleased with your presence. It was said that when the heretics built the monastery, they placed within the vault the greatest treasure of the faith. Others have implied that it holds their false god. This adventure hook would feel at home in most RPGs, but Obsidian are well known for taking tried and true setups and giving them an interesting twist, and the same is true here. You fight your way through the undead remains of the heretics, uncover the fate of an Azionite saint who disappeared within while the heretics still controlled the monastery, and fight the High Priest Molokai, an undead Agarlan giant. Finally, you find yourself face to face with the cult's false god. The twist being, the god in question is an unwilling participant in the cult. In the deepest room in the vault is a golden statue of a Lamassu, a mythical beast crossed between an eagle and a lion. The Lamassu was sacred to Azionai and served him well. Like the elves of Dungeon Siege 2, they also possessed the gift of foresight, but as they gradually died out, that gift became more and more concentrated in those that remained. Molokai, while he was still a faithful proponent of the church, found the last of the Lamassu dying in the Arannoi desert, not far from where the monastery would be built. He bound the soul of the Lamassu to a golden idol and placed it within the vaults. Being a Garland, Molokai had been alive since the time of Azionai, and so remembered a time when their god spoke to the faithful directly. After his death, though, the church were left to pray in silence. Molokai's new idol was a gift in that respect. Finally their god would speak to them again through it, and for a time the idol used its powers to grant Molokai with prophecies, who would then relay them to his congregation. The Lamassu was willing to do this as it believed that by doing so, he was still serving Azionai. In time, however, the monastery stopped worshipping Azionai through the idol, and began worshipping the idol itself. The Lamassu would stop granting prophecies, refusing to use its power as a false god, but that didn't stop Molokai granting proclamations of his own. When the Legion caught wind of the heretical order, they assaulted the monastery, sealed the vault, and there they remained, the Lamassu and Molokai, until Damani arrived, and later your party. Damani sought the Lamassu with a single goal in mind. You find him dead at its feet, but before he died he was able to speak with the idol and ask it for the favour he had travelled so far to gain. Damani wanted the idol to protect his daughter. Knowing Cassinda was looking for all the children of the Legion, he asked that the Lamassu use its power both over the desert and of prophecy to protect her, to which the Lamassu agreed. She's still there when you arrive. Sister Eleanor, the nun who helped you access the vault, is that daughter, and the Lamassu has watched over her since. With the mystery of Damani's disappearance solved, all that's left is to decide what's to be done with his daughter. She knows who she is, she just needs advice on what to do about it. The Lamassu is able to tell you what will happen to her depending on your choice. If you tell her to remain in the church, she'll hide her past and slowly work her way up until she is a high-ranking member in the church. There she will be an agent for great change within, as well as a conduit for peace with the Legion following the defeat of Jane Cassinda. Alternatively, she can return with you to rejoin the Legion. There she will become the head of a great household, her descendants will strengthen the Legion and even produce future Grand Masters, but she herself will die saving the life of another Legionnaire, possibly even you or one of your companions, shortly after the birth of her first child. The choice is an interesting one, though not one with any impact given its disconnect from the main campaign. What does connect it to the campaign, however, are the parallels between the Lamassu and Jane Cassinda herself. In both cases, they were revered for their place in the church, but as time passed, their followers began to worship them instead. Unlike the Lamassu, however, Jane has been using this to her advantage ever since. Your first confrontation with Jane is within the Glitterdelve mines. Her army has been besieging it as the final stronghold of the royalist forces protecting Queen Rosalind. Rosalind and those of the royal court who haven't been captured by Cassinda yet have been fighting a losing battle, barely keeping ahead of Jane only through the visitations of the Radiant Youth, a kind of guardian figure to the Legion who supports you throughout the game. Rosalind is a good person, but it's not clear if she's a good queen. She's young, optimistic, and effortlessly likeable, cares deeply about her people and strives to do the right thing, but whether she has the strength to cope with the wars and courtly intrigue that lay before her remain to be seen. You've no choice but to support her, but whether you're doing so because you believe in her righteousness, or see her as an easily manipulated puppet is up to you. She shares Jane's conviction, but it's clear she's outmatched. It's while helping Rosalind and the Royalist forces in their last stand that you finally get to meet Jane in person. She comes to see the group who have been interrupting her plans, along with Rajani if you spared her. Rajani will speak in your favour if she's present, will introduce doubt as to whether you and the Legion are as dangerous as Jane claims you are, but regardless of if she's there, this first speech with Jane is one of the highlights of the game. I've been dancing around the subject this whole time because once I start talking about Jane properly, it feels like there's little else worthy of discussion. She's by far my favourite element in the narrative, and the game is full of worthwhile narrative elements. Dungeon Siege 3 up to this point has been narratively standing toe-to-toe with some of the best action RPGs available, but the complexity and detail in Jane's character rivals that of full-fat RPGs. Jane is confident, headstrong, and utterly convincing in her conviction. Once you've met her, there's no question as to how she could have rallied the people against you. Given the whole holy warrior leading a peasant revolt narrative she's got going on, it seems likely she's heavily inspired by Joan of Arc. But to put it in more fantasy terms, what you're facing as an antagonist is effectively a lawful good paladin. This is no dark lord seeking to rule the world for its own sake, nor another ancient evil being awakened. It's a person who might genuinely be right that she's the best future for the kingdom, and that's difficult to fight against. The meeting with Jane introduces 3 twists to the narrative. The first is that Jane is half Archon. The Archons are a pretty tight-knit group now that there are so few of them, and it's only your companion Anjali who stands against her, the others are all working for her. The second is the other half of her heritage. Jane is the daughter of the dead king. As Rosalind's aunt, she may even have been in line for the throne before Rosalind's father was. She isn't trying to take over the kingdom illegitimately, she has a genuine claim to the crown and is only pursuing it because she sees Rosalind's kindness, her softness, as a sign she's too weak to lead Ebb. It's funny that Lucas seems the main character back when the game starts. True, Lucas and Reinhardt have stronger connections to the Legion, but this conversation reveals that the women have far stronger connections to Jane. Anjali shares her Archon heritage, which makes Jane the only chance she may have to uncover the mysteries of her birth. Katarina, on the other hand, shares a very similar backstory to Jane. Both were of split heritage, both the illegitimate daughters of powerful men, both gaining mystical abilities from their mothers. I can't say for sure how Lucas and Reinhardt's perspectives alter the experience of the story. I played as Katarina and had Anjali with me the entire time. This setup, the connections the two have to Jane, the similarities in their backstories, certainly make Jane far more sympathetic than she already is. More so, since both Jane and Katarina now find themselves on a campaign of revenge against those responsible for their father's death. That's the important third element. When she rallied the people against the Legion for killing the king, that wasn't a lie. The Legion absolutely killed him. This is confirmed by Lord Devonsey, an ex-Legion commander who abandoned the Order and joined the Royal Army, ashamed at the actions of his Brotherhood. Not that you needed his confirmation, there's little doubt once you meet her, Jane seems incapable of lying, but Devonsey does provide a more nuanced version of events. He claims the king was a tyrant who had been moving to limit the power of the Legion. Legion commanders claimed he needed to be removed for the good of the people. Hugh Montbarron headed a plot to have him deposed and place his son on the throne, but when the moment came, something went wrong. No one now lives who was in the room at the time, so the specifics are unknown, but one way or another, Hugh Montbarron did kill the king. From Jane's perspective, she watched her father become more and more convinced the Legion was moving against him, and then the Legion killed him. It's no surprise she rose up against them. Like every other antagonist throughout the game, she is not the aggressor she seems to be. She is acting in response to violence committed against her, and in doing so continuing the cycle, something that you're doing as well. The reveal that the lie that led to the Legion's downfall was true after all really shakes the assumption that the Legion is a force for good. It can be, but only if the people within make it so. If you aren't willing to do the right thing, there's nothing stopping it from descending into tyranny itself. This possibility is exemplified by two characters who take on supporting roles. Odo and Martin remain in the chapter house while you adventure for most of the game, but they often take on the role of the Legion's conscience. Martin is the younger of the two. Like your characters, he's a child of the Legion, mostly raised after its fall. His head is filled with stories of the Legion's righteousness, the good they did, and he's a firm supporter of such things. He supports granting mercy to your enemies, avoiding conflict where possible, doing the right thing. Odo is older and far more cynical. He was a full member when the Legion fell, and he's the one who first started gathering the surviving children of the Legion to rebuild. He's described as having been a scout, though dialogue suggests at times that his role was far more sinister than that moniker would imply. His outlook is less charitable. While Martin and even Queen Rosalind see some form of peace with Jane as possible, there's no doubt in Odo's mind that Jane has to die. More than that, when he learns the truth of the king's death, it doesn't change his mind. While Martin is of the opinion that the Legion should own up to its past, admit its mistakes and strive to be better, Odo disagrees. He doesn't want the truth known, he wants it buried and for the Legion's supposed honour to remain untarnished. He openly states, quote, "If we win this war, Jane will be dead, her words become lies and ours become truth." End quote. Odo knows history is written by the victor, and he fully intends to make some revisions. To hear such a statement from someone who is introduced as your guide on this journey, from the character in the wizened advisor role, is such a killer way to undermine the player's confidence in whether they're doing the right thing. It introduces moral complexities to the narrative that elevate Dungeon Siege 3 far beyond its initial impressions. Jane shakes up the morality of the narrative in some fascinating ways. I'd say the first meeting with her is the strongest part of the game, but talking to her at the end gives it stiff competition for that position. Having defended Rosalind from Jane's army in Glitterdelve, and gained the support of Stonebridge's automaton army, it's time to bring the fight to Jane's doorstep. The assault on the Spire, her massive temple fortress in the mountains, lacks the visual spectacle it deserves due to the camera placement. Obsidian did a surprisingly good job of implementing impressive vistas despite the restrictive camera, often showing areas you'll reach later from mountain pathways and overlooks, but the Spire lacks the sense of scale that it's due. Mechanically, it's also a little underwhelming due to the unbalanced power curve, with only the boss fights within providing any kind of appropriate challenge. By this point in the game, however, the narrative has been doing the heavy lifting for some time, and it's not ready to drop it yet. If you spared her, Rajani will be here to aid you. Jane's increasing desperation has been worrying her sisters, and the presence of Angeli is the final straw that they've been following the wrong path. Despite her use of the Asinine faith to gain followers, Jane is still a follower of the old creator gods the Archons once aided, and when you defeat her at the peak of the Spire, it's those old gods she'll be beseeching for aid. The final confrontation with Jane takes place where the narrative started, deep within the forests of the Mornweald where she killed Hugh Montbarron and the commanders of the Legion. The forest contains a piece of an old creator god, a seed of creation, and Jane seeks to use it to resurrect that god, along with the Archons and their other servants. The final stretch is an apocalyptic gauntlet through the burning wood, suitably climactic, but it's still the narrative that's truly engaging. The creator god comes back wrong, everything Jane resurrects does, corrupted and monstrous, and only by defeating them can you find out why. The corruption of the Mournweald began 30 years ago when Jane lashed out in anger and used the power of creation held within to annihilate the Legion. Her motivations, using the power of creation to destroy, corrupted the forest. Now she's making the same mistake, rendering the Archons she resurrects monstrous, and since she used the last of the power within the wood to resurrect the creator god at its heart, defeating it finally removes that power. Which is tragic in its way. The power of creation isn't good or evil, rather it is defined by how you use it, and Jane's used it poorly. It's like the Legion in that way. The resurrection of the Legion will only be a benefit to Ebb if the people who embody it actively work for the benefit of Ebb. This is what I find so striking about Dungeon Siege 3. The Legion and creation magic, Jane and Katarina, all the antagonists, instead of a series of disconnected elements, the writing connects these aspects of the story thematically. It explores many of the same themes and elements I found so engaging in the original. I said that each danger you faced in that was a problem caused by your ancestors come back to haunt you, and the same is true of the enemies here. Each is acting in response to old violence, continuing the cycle. Even Jane's attempt to resurrect the Archons mirrors the attempts to bring back the Sec, but with the caveat that the danger of doing so is not inherent to the race, but a consequence of the motivations of the one bringing them back. All of the interesting narrative elements of the original are mirrored here in some form or another, but it's done so with so much more depth and precision. Dungeon Siege 3 may have abandoned the mechanics that made the original unique, but manages to deliver everything its narrative was lacking, and then some. All that's left, of course, is to decide what's to be done with Jane. Seeing how her actions have destroyed something she cares about, the seed of creation held within the Mournweald, and realising she is outmatched, she accepts her fate, utterly convinced you will execute her. Before you decide, however, you get one last chance to interrogate her, learn events from her perspective. It's here when her characterization really shines. There's no guile in her words, no deception. You can be absolutely sure she means every word she is saying. It hits just the right level of regret, too. She admits her guilt at utterly destroying the Legion. She wanted Hugh Montbarron to pay for the death of her father, but when the Legion refused to turn him over, she saw no other option. If she had been completely repentant, it would have been too much, but seeing her admit she regrets how many died, but she would kill Hugh Montbarron again without hesitation, only solidifies the sense that you can trust what she's saying. He definitely seems to have deserved it too. When she describes the smug look on his face when she finally destroyed him and his commanders, you can't help but feel sorry for her. Montbarron deliberately fled to the Mournweald, not for any general tactical reason, but specifically because he knew the place was sacred to the Archons, to Jane. He chose that spot because he thought Jane wouldn't dare fight him there. He was wrong, and yet it feels like it was Jane who suffered for it, seeing how her need for revenge ultimately destroyed something so dear to her and her sisters. People often look at decision points in games and treat their difficulty as some kind of metric of quality. If it's hard to make a decision, if you spend a long time staring at the options struggling to choose, it must be good, right? I thought that too until I played Dungeon Siege 3. The decision to spare Jane is one of the easiest choices I've ever faced, and I still think it remains one of the best examples of how player choice can enhance a narrative. The benefit of these kinds of decisions aren't that they allow a player to direct the narrative to their choosing, but rather that they encourage the player to more thoroughly engage with it, to give more consideration to the actions they're taking, to the role they're playing. The decision to spare Jane isn't worse because I hit the button so quick, it's a testament to how invested I had become that my mind was already made up. The question of what's to be done about Jane is likely in the back of your mind throughout the game. By the time the prompt arrives, you've likely spent hours hearing the arguments for and against it, not to mention the tangentially related decisions and narrative components that connect to it thematically. By the time the choice was before me, there was no doubt in my mind. Jane must live. The cycle of violence had to end, and she deserves her redemption. It's rare to find myself so heavily invested in a character, let alone an antagonist, let alone in an action RPG. I would never have been able to become that invested if I'd dismissed the game out of hand because it played differently and got some lore wrong back in Hour 1. Beyond her surprise at being granted mercy, the effects of your choice will only become apparent in the ending slides. They're far more detailed and complex than those in Broken World, which is to be expected. Obsidian as a studio are descended from the teams that helped originate the feature. True, they aren't as extensive as others, but still far in excess of what is expected of action RPGs. Various side quests have their own slides detailing how completing or not completing them affected the world, and importantly the results of your actions are often unexpected. For me though, they presented a thoroughly satisfying ending. The Cyclopses got their union, and became citizens of Stonebridge. The Lascanzi witches found a permanent home in Gunderic Manor. The Archons rallied behind Angeli, and most importantly, Jane worked with the Legion to calm the tensions in Ebb. Maybe for others it's more fitting that she was exiled from Ebb to find a new home with her sisters, or given over to the custody of her niece Rosalind, but that's the other advantage of being given a choice. You aren't just encouraged to more thoroughly engage with the narrative, but you can subtly shift it to be the most thematically resonant for you, creating something truly memorable. The original Dungeon Siege took the structure and narrative of an action RPG and combined it with a simplified set of mechanics more commonly associated with classic RPGs. This combination was unique, but never quite worked. Dungeon Siege 2 improved upon its narrative elements with more lore and more detailed characters, but ultimately suffered from diluting the combat into something that combined the shortcomings of each system. Dungeon Siege 3 looked at the formula from a different direction. Rather than taking the weaker element from each and trying to cancel them out, here the strongest elements are combined. With the combat of ARPGs and the narrative style and structure of more traditional RPGs, Dungeon Siege 3 finally feels like the promise of the original was realised, even if it wasn't in the form that people expected. I like the original game, and I admit I'd still love to see other games take a crack at its particular style of party-based action-focused combat, but when I think of that game, I think of the hours of rather repetitive combat, not the world or its story. Dungeon Siege 3 may have lost something by abandoning the specifics of the series, but what it gained is worth that loss. People often claim gameplay is everything, and it's important, sure, but the Dungeon Siege series is a clear indicator, to me at least, that it's narrative and storytelling that sticks. It's the context in which you play that really resonates with a person, that makes a game memorable, not the specifics of the gameplay. I'd left behind the hours of combat I went through in Dungeon Siege almost as soon as I'd finished it, but I'll be carrying Jane Cassinda with me for a long time to come. Thanks for watching.